Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Have you ever stared at your reflection for too long, wondering if it might move on its own? I used to think it was a silly thought, something people joked about. But that was before I knew what it was like to feel truly watched. It started on a quiet Sunday morning, a day that seemed like any other. I woke up to the soft light filtering through the curtains, and for some reason, I was drawn to the bathroom mirror. I didn't know why, it was just something that felt urgent, like I needed to check something. I looked into the mirror as I splashed cold water on my face, my hands brushing through my hair. But as I wiped the droplets away, I noticed something strange. My reflection didn't move the way it should. It was subtle at first, a slight delay in the way my reflection followed my actions, like it needed a second to catch up. But when I moved my hand to touch my face again, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. The reflection didn't follow my lead. It stayed frozen for a moment, but then it shifted on its own. It wasn't like a simple delay. My reflection had changed its pose, its hand had dropped to its side, as though it had its own will. My stomach turned. I stepped back from the mirror, blinking hard, thinking it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. Maybe I was still half asleep, I reasoned. But no, when I took another step forward, the reflection did it again. It shifted. It turned its head slightly, as if it had just noticed me looking at it. My own face stared back at me, but there was something different in its eyes. It wasn't my expression. It was empty, lifeless, as if the reflection was not mine at all. I backed away, shaking my head in disbelief. This is nothing. I'm just tired, I whispered to myself. But my heart raced. The next few minutes felt surreal. I couldn't pull myself away from the mirror. I watched as my reflection shifted again. This time, its mouth twitched into a small, unsettling smile. I felt a chill run through my body. This wasn't right. I reached forward, trying to touch the surface of the glass, but the reflection didn't react. It just waited. I pulled my hand back. That was when I heard it, just a soft tapping noise, like fingers gently tapping on glass. I turned, but there was no one there. Only the reflection. It was alive. The reflection didn't stay still anymore. It moved independently of me, its movements subtle at first but growing bolder as I watched. Each time I tried to pull away, it seemed to follow me, matching my movements but adding its own twist. It felt like it was mocking me. I needed to get out of that bathroom. But as I turned to leave, I caught one final glimpse of the mirror. The reflection wasn't following me anymore. It was staring directly at me, no longer mimicking my movements. And it smiled again. A slow, knowing smile. It was then that I realized I wasn't just seeing my reflection. Something else was in the mirror. Something that had its own plans. And it was watching me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. That smile. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But the moment I walked away from the mirror, a feeling of unease settled into my bones. It was as if the reflection, the thing on the other side of the glass, was still there, watching me, waiting. For the rest of the day, I avoided looking in mirrors. I didn't want to face what I had seen, the unsettling knowledge that something in my reflection wasn't mine. But as night fell and I got ready for bed, I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to look. I approached the mirror slowly, keeping my distance as I brushed my teeth. I stared at my reflection, hoping, praying that everything would just be normal again. But it wasn't. There it was, waiting for me. This time, it wasn't just the smile. It was the way my reflection moved. It was subtle, but impossible to ignore. As I bent down to put my toothbrush back in the holder, my reflection did the same, but then it stopped. It stayed bent over, holding its position longer than I did. The reflection's head turned slowly toward me, and I felt a cold shiver creep up my spine. My own reflection was not copying me anymore. It had its own intentions. I stepped back, dropping the toothbrush in shock. My reflection stood still for a moment, then began to move again, this time its hand reaching out, slowly, towards the edge of the mirror. I took a deep breath, my heart hammering in my chest. It couldn't be real. Could it? I was about to turn away again, to walk out of the bathroom, but then something caught my eye. The reflection, it wasn't looking at me. Not anymore. It was looking past me, as if there was something, or someone, standing behind me. My head snapped around. The bathroom was empty. I quickly turned back to the mirror, but the reflection was already facing me again, its eyes locked onto mine. I could see the movement now. It wasn't mimicking me anymore. It was doing something else. Something alive. The smile returned, this time wider, stretching unnaturally across its face. It was mocking me. My pulse raced as the reflection's mouth moved slightly, as if it were speaking silently, taunting me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in its gaze. My reflection began to pull away from the glass. Its body slouched, as if it was climbing out, its fingers scraping against the edge of the mirror. The surface rippled, warped, as if the glass itself was alive, bending under the pressure of something trying to break free. The reflection's movements became more erratic, as if it were desperate to get out. In a panic, I stumbled backward, my feet colliding with the bathroom counter. I glanced at the mirror one last time, and for a moment, I thought I saw the reflection's hand reach out towards me, its fingers curling as if it wanted to grab me, pull me through. I slammed the bathroom door shut. My chest heaved, and I could feel my body trembling uncontrollably. I pressed my back against the door, but my mind wouldn't let go of what I'd seen. My reflection had changed. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something else. And I wasn't sure if it was trapped or if it was coming for me. I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't escape it. Not if it had its way. The room felt colder now. I tried to steady my breathing, but the fear wouldn't leave me. That reflection, whatever it was no longer just a part of me. It was alive, and I could feel it waiting for the moment when it would break free. But what would happen then? The thought lingered in my mind as the room fell silent, the only sound the beating of my heart. I had no idea how long I stood there, paralyzed. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to see it again. But deep down, I knew that I couldn't run forever. And the longer I waited, the more I realized the reflection was getting closer. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, the reflection, stretching, twisting, pulling at the glass. The cold, mocking smile haunted my every thought. By morning, the exhaustion weighed heavy on my shoulders, but I knew I couldn't ignore what was happening. I had to face it. I had to understand it, if I could. I started the day with a resolve that quickly wavered the moment I stood in front of the bathroom mirror. My reflection was back to its usual stillness, but there was something different about it. The eyes. They were darker, more hollow. It wasn't just that they were watching me, they seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for me to make a move. I cautiously reached out with one hand, watching as my reflection mirrored the movement. But this time, my hand hesitated. It felt like it wasn't my own. I jerked it back, but my reflection didn't. It remained still, unnaturally still, as if it was waiting for me to make a mistake. Suddenly, the air around me thickened. A cold breeze brushed across my skin, despite the fact that the windows were all closed. I looked behind me, but there was nothing there. I glanced back at the mirror. My reflection was still, but I could feel it. Something was different this time. It was no longer just a simple image. It felt alive, as if the reflection had developed a mind of its own. I took a deep breath and backed away, my eyes still glued to the mirror. The moment I turned to leave, I heard it. A soft scrape. I froze. It came again, louder this time, a dragging sound, like nails on glass. Slowly, I turned around. The reflection was no longer mimicking me. It was moving on its own. At first, I thought I was seeing things. But no, it was unmistakable. The reflection's hand, pale and thin, reached toward the glass. It was not my hand. It was elongated, its fingers unnaturally long, and they scraped the surface of the mirror as if searching for something on the other side. I felt my heart skip a beat. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. The reflection's hand pressed harder, and I saw the glass begin to distort, like it was breathing, expanding, and contracting with each movement. A sick feeling churned in my stomach. The reflection was trying to break through. I backed up, stumbling over the edge of the sink, my breath shallow and rapid. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The hand dragged itself across the surface, and the image flickered. The reflection wasn't just standing there anymore. It was moving, pushing against the glass, as if it was trying to pull itself free. And then it happened. The glass cracked. At first, it was a tiny hairline crack, almost unnoticeable. But it grew, slowly, steadily. A deep, jagged line, splitting across the mirror. My reflection didn't stop. It kept pulling, as if it was trying to break through the barrier that separated it from me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, but it wasn't enough. I could hear the cracking, the splintering of glass behind me, echoing through the house. I didn't dare look back. But I couldn't escape the feeling that someone, was following me. I rushed to my bedroom and slammed the door shut, but the sound of cracking glass was still there, growing louder. I could hear the scratching of nails, now coming from multiple directions. It wasn't just in the bathroom anymore. It was all around me. I pressed my back against the door, trying to steady my breathing. The room was dim, the only light coming from the small crack between the door and the floor. The shadows seemed to shift, stretch, as if they were alive, like they were reaching for me. I thought I saw something in the corner of the room, something dark, something moving. I turned toward it, my blood running cold. But when I looked, it was gone. The door rattled violently, as if something was trying to break in. I felt a rush of panic flood through me, and I scrambled to my feet, looking for a way out. But there was no escape. The reflection wasn't just trapped behind the glass anymore. It was here, in my room, in the darkness with me. It was waiting for the moment when it would finally break free. And as the glass cracked louder, I knew it was only a matter of time before it did. The mirror had already shattered once. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't hide. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. And whatever had come through the glass was now standing in front of me. The room seemed to freeze. A deep, suffocating silence filled the air, and I could feel every nerve in my body tense as I stared at the shadows standing in front of me. My heart pounded against my ribs, every beat a loud, painful thud in the otherwise still room. I didn't dare move. I didn't want to provoke it. I knew, deep down, that this thing was not just a reflection. It was something else entirely. Something far darker. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and I could feel the weight of its gaze on me. Slowly, I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to look at the figure more closely. It wasn't completely human. Its outline was distorted, its features blurry and indistinct, as if it was still trapped between the reflection and the real world. But I saw the eyes. Those eyes that had once only been in the mirror now stared at me from the darkness, empty, hollow, but alive with something ancient. My body went rigid as the figure took a step forward. The floor creaked beneath it, but there was no sound from its movement, only the soft, unsettling whisper of air as it shifted closer. I took a step back, and the figure mirrored my movement. I froze again, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just following me now. It was copying everything I did. It was moving, just like I was, but it was faster. It was always one step ahead of me, always in the corner of my vision, lurking in the shadows. But what terrified me most was that it didn't seem to need the mirror anymore. The crack in the glass hadn't just allowed it to escape, it had freed it. This thing wasn't bound by reflection anymore. It could move on its own. I stumbled backward, my hand grabbing for anything to steady myself, my phone, my wallet, anything to break the paralysis. My fingers brushed against the cold surface of my nightstand, and I yanked open the drawer, desperately searching for something. Anything. A flashlight. That was all I could find. I flicked it on, the beam of light shaking in my hand as I pointed it toward the corner where the figure had been. But the light revealed nothing. The shadows seemed to absorb it, hiding whatever had been there just moments before. My head spun. Where did it go? Was it still there? Was I losing my mind? The flashlight beam flickered, and when it steadied, I saw it again. The figure was standing directly in front of me, so close I could almost feel its presence, like a heavy weight pressing against my chest. My body refused to move. I could feel the coldness radiating off of it, seeping into my skin. It smiled. I couldn't see its lips, but I knew it was smiling. I saw the curve of its mouth, twisted and unnatural, and it sent a shock of cold fear straight through me. It was grinning at me. I backed away, but it didn't stop. Each step I took, it mirrored. Each movement I made, it followed, until there was nowhere left for me to go. I slammed my back against the wall, the cold touch of the surface sending shivers through me. My breath was shallow, my mind racing. What was it? Why was it doing this to me? The figure raised its hand slowly, the same hand I had seen in the reflection before, the one that had reached out through the mirror. And as it reached forward, I saw the fingers stretch unnaturally long, twisted and contorted, like they were reaching for something beyond me, something I couldn't see. It touched my arm. The coldness of its touch shot through me like a jolt of electricity. My whole body went numb, paralyzed. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. It was like its touch had frozen me in place. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. I couldn't break the gaze of its hollow, empty eyes. The more I looked into them, the more I felt myself sinking into something dark. A voice whispered from somewhere deep within my mind, a voice that wasn't mine. It was cold, distant, and empty. "It's not just your reflection," the voice hissed. It never was. Suddenly, the world around me blurred, the edges of my vision turning to shadows. The figure pulled away, and for a moment, I felt a strange relief, like I could finally breathe again. But then, it happened. I blinked, and in that instant, the room was gone. The walls, the floor, the bed, everything around me disappeared. And I was back in the mirror. The reflection stood there, looking at me, smiling. And it wasn't me anymore. It was free. It was me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It had replaced me. It had taken my place. I was trapped in the mirror, staring out at the world, while the reflection stood in my place. And then the glass shattered. But not on my side. I could only watch in helpless horror as the figure stepped out into my world, its smile widening, its hollow eyes gleaming with something darker than I had ever imagined. It was free, and I was left to face the truth. The reflection had always been alive, and now it was taking over. I woke up, gasping for breath, as if I had been underwater for too long. The air around me was thick with a strange, suffocating heaviness. My eyes darted around my room, and I felt an overwhelming sense of confusion. Had it been a dream? Had it all been a nightmare? But no! The feeling was wrong. Something wasn't right. I sat up, my heart racing. The room was the same faint glow of morning light filtering through the curtains. My reflection in the mirror, was normal. It was me. Just me. But my hands shook. My head swirled with questions, the terrible images of the previous night flooding back like a tidal wave. I knew what had happened. I knew that that thing from the mirror, had somehow crossed over. It had taken my place. It had. I forced myself to look at the reflection again. It was still just me, standing in front of the mirror, my face pale and tired from the sleepless night. But something was wrong. I could feel it. The reflection wasn't mine anymore. The silence in the room felt too still. There was a tension in the air, a subtle vibration that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My reflection, shifted slightly, and I froze. It moved. My chest tightened. I blinked rapidly, but no matter how hard I tried, the reflection remained alive. It moved subtly, like it was aware of my every thought. It tilted its head slightly to the side, just like I had done a moment before. It wasn't me anymore. I wasn't in control. My heart began to pound, louder now. The reflection raised its hand, and I could feel the coldness of its gaze on me. Its smile, that twisted, unnatural smile, widened just a fraction. I couldn't breathe. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. It wasn't just mimicking me, it was mocking me. I backed away slowly, my legs weak beneath me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The thing from the mirror wasn't just trying to replace me anymore. It was trying to consume me. It wanted me to be nothing, to become a shadow behind the glass while it lived my life. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I grabbed the handle. I yanked it open and stumbled into the hallway, running blindly toward the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I needed to get away. I needed to escape. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still with me, that it was following me, moving just behind me, a step away from taking over everything. I reached the front door, my hand hovering over the handle, when I stopped. The room behind me, my apartment, my life, felt so far away, like I was being pulled from it. I glanced back, my heart seizing in my chest. In the mirror, I saw it. It was standing there, watching me. But it wasn't a reflection anymore. It was in the real world now. It stepped toward me, its grin wider than ever, its eyes cold and empty. I could hear its footsteps echoing in the hallway, growing louder and louder with every second, until it reached me. And then it whispered, in a voice that sounded far too familiar. "You can't run anymore." I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me, but the sound of the whisper lingered in my mind. I could still feel its eyes on me, its presence suffocating me, filling every corner of my thoughts. I backed away from the door, trembling uncontrollably. But I knew it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. I had escaped once, but this time, there was no way out. I had been replaced. I was tired, just looking for a place to rest for the night. After a long drive, the idea of a bed and a warm shower seemed like the only thing I needed. I didn't think much about the hotel. It was small, quiet, tucked away at the edge of town. I didn't notice much about the building either. It had a certain charm, the kind you see in old places, with faded signs and weathered walls. But it was enough for me to stop. The receptionist gave me a quick smile when I walked in. It was late, the desk dimly lit, the air smelling of stale coffee and dust. I was handed a key, its number written on a small tag. Room 27. Up the stairs, first door to the right, she said, voice a bit too monotone, like she had said it 100 times before. I nodded, grateful for the simplicity. I grabbed my bag and walked towards the stairs. The building creaked under my steps, but I didn't think much of it. I was already half lost in the idea of sleep, so I followed the path without much care. The door to room 27 was exactly as it should be, old, wooden, with a brass handle that looked polished but worn. I slid the key into the lock, but nothing happened. I tried again, turning the key with more force, but still nothing. The lock remained stiff, the door firmly shut. Odd, I muttered and tried once more. But the key wouldn't turn. I stepped back, my mind trying to make sense of the situation. Maybe it was a mistake. I walked back to the receptionist, my footsteps echoing down the empty hall. The woman looked up from behind her desk, the same tired expression on her face. "Is there a problem?" she asked, a hint of disinterest in her voice. "Room 27, I said. "The key's not working." She didn't blink, didn't flinch. "There is no room 27, she said simply. I froze. "What do you mean, there's no room 27? Her eyes met mine, a strange, unreadable look in them. "There is no room 27 here." I felt a cold rush flood my chest. "I was just given the key," I said, showing it to her. She stared at it for a moment, then looked back up at me. "There is no room 27. Her voice was calm, unnervingly calm. She didn't seem to be lying. But how could this be? I had just seen the room number. I had just tried the door. I was sure I had been given the key for that very room. I didn't know what to say. I stood there, feeling a strange tension in the air, the silence between us growing heavier. The receptionist didn't offer any further explanation, her expression unchanging. "Could you check again?" I asked, but my voice sounded unsure, even to me. I felt a rising discomfort in the pit of my stomach, as if something was not quite right. She didn't respond, simply shook her head. "There is no room 27. My mind raced, thoughts swirling as the reality of the situation began to sink in. I had to be mistaken, but the key was real. The door was real. I had seen the number. I couldn't just walk away from this. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I took a step back. "Could I have a different room?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. The whole situation was starting to feel off. The woman didn't speak, she simply nodded, her eyes still cold, detached. I turned back towards the hallway. I didn't know if I was more frightened by the strange behavior of the receptionist or the unsettling thought that perhaps the room I had tried to enter didn't even exist. My mind tried to shake off the thought. It was late. I needed rest. I wasn't going to overthink it. But as I walked down the hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoed louder than before, and the walls felt as if they were closing in. The air, which had been still and quiet, now felt thick, pressing against me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. When I turned the corner, I saw the next door ahead. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was the only thing that stood out in the hall. Its number? 27. I stopped dead in my tracks. I knew I had seen the hallway before. I had seen that door. But this time, there was no key in my hand. No receptionist telling me the room didn't exist. Just the door. The door that was now calling me. I couldn't help myself. I walked toward it. As I moved closer to the door, something twisted inside me. It was like an invisible force, a magnetic pull, urging me to reach out. My hand hovered above the doorknob, frozen for a moment. I could hear my heartbeat loud in my ears, the sound strangely muffled as if the world around me had become distant. This wasn't normal. It couldn't be. I had already been told that room 27 didn't exist. I had already seen the hallway, and I was certain I hadn't passed this door before. It was new. A trick of the light, maybe? Or was I losing track of time? My mind was becoming foggy, the kind of fog that descends when something isn't quite right, but you can't put your finger on it. My hand reached out, trembling, and touched the cold, smooth surface of the door. It felt real. The texture of the wood was solid under my fingertips, the edges worn and smooth from years of use. It was the same as the door I had tried earlier, same design, same brass handle, everything. But this time, the handle turned easily under my grip. The door creaked open. A gust of cold air rushed out from the crack, chilling me to the bone. It smelled damp, stale, like something forgotten and untouched for years. The hallway seemed darker now, shadows twisting in the corners, stretching unnaturally long, reaching toward me. I hesitated, unsure whether to step inside or close the door and walk away. But my feet, they seemed to move on their own. I crossed the threshold into the room before I could stop myself. The room was small, nothing extravagant. A single bed, a faded nightstand, an old lamp with a yellowish bulb that flickered dimly. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and a single window was cracked open, allowing a thin sliver of moonlight to creep inside. It wasn't much to look at, just a forgotten place that hadn't seen any care in years. But there was something about it. Something wrong. The air was too still, the silence too thick. It felt like I had stepped into a place that wasn't meant to be seen, a room that should have stayed hidden. I walked farther inside, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The door clicked shut behind me, but I didn't hear it. It was as if it had closed too softly, too quietly, not even leaving a sound in its wake. The room was suffocatingly silent now. I turned to the window, hoping the cool night air might clear my mind. But when I looked out, I saw nothing. No trees, no buildings, no stars. Just blackness, an endless, deep void that stretched far beyond the glass. I felt a rush of panic rise in my chest. This wasn't right. There should have been something out there. Something familiar. I moved away from the window and glanced around the room. The bed was perfectly made, the sheets folded neatly, the pillow untouched. But the lamp flickered again, its light dimming and then flashing back to life, like it was trying to send some kind of signal. I stepped closer, drawn to it, and noticed the flickering was becoming more erratic. Almost purposeful. Then I heard it. A faint, almost inaudible sound from the far corner of the room. It was like a whisper, soft at first, like the brushing of fabric against fabric. But then it grew clearer, a footstep, slow and deliberate. I froze. The room was empty. I was alone. I turned slowly toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing. Just the corner, dark and undisturbed. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just my imagination. I had been driving for hours, and I was tired. I needed sleep. But as I reached for the light switch, something caught my eye. The door. The one I had come through. It was slightly ajar. Just enough to let a sliver of darkness spill in from the hallway. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't heard anyone enter. I was alone in the room. And yet, the door was open. A strange, oppressive feeling gripped me. I wasn't sure if I should leave or stay. Both choices felt dangerous in their own way. I stepped toward the door, moving cautiously. The hallway outside was darker than before, the faint light from the bulb casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me, as if the darkness itself was trying to reach out and pull me back into the unknown. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could hear something now, faint sounds, footsteps echoing down the hall. But no one was there. The hallway was empty, just like before. No one else was in the hotel. I had checked. I reached for the handle, but before I could open it, I heard the whisper again. Louder this time. Clearer. Don't go. The words weren't from anyone I could see. They came from everywhere and nowhere at once. A voice in the air, a voice in my mind, all around me, as if it was inside my thoughts. I stopped, frozen in place. My pulse hammered in my ears, and my breath became shallow. Something was terribly wrong. The door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the walls. I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the flickering lamp and the oppressive silence that had filled the room once more. I was trapped. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I had ever left. My heart was a drumbeat in my chest, loud and erratic. I could hear nothing but the thumping of my pulse in my ears, the cold sweat creeping down my back. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in, pushing me toward the center, forcing me to confront the growing terror gnawing at the edges of my mind. I backed away from the door, my feet dragging as if the floor itself was pulling me deeper into the room. My eyes flicked to the corners, dark, silent, oppressive. Nothing had changed, but everything felt wrong. The air was thicker, heavier, like it had stopped breathing altogether. There was no escape. No way out. And then the whisper came again. This time, it wasn't just a single voice. It was a chorus of murmurs, soft and insistent, coming from every direction. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the voices. "Get out," they hissed. "No." "Stay," another voice contradicted, low and guttural. I couldn't make sense of the words. They overlapped, tangled together in a confusing mess of sounds. But the feeling was clear. The room didn't want me here. And yet, every instinct screamed for me to leave. But every step toward the door felt like I was moving farther from reality. I turned away from the door, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the nightstand, trying to steady myself. I needed a moment to think, to breathe. But the voices kept coming, growing louder now, as if the very fabric of the room was vibrating with their presence. I glanced at the window again, desperate for some sense of familiarity, but the darkness beyond the glass was even deeper now. It pressed in, a suffocating weight. I couldn't see anything. No stars. No night sky. Just an endless void, swallowing everything whole. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, frozen, my mind spiraling into chaos. Time didn't make sense anymore. The walls seemed to pulse, the faintest shifting sound like a heartbeat just beneath the surface. I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone. I could feel it now, presence, in the air, something unseen, lurking in the periphery of my vision. The air was thick with the weight of it. The shadows weren't just shadows, they were alive, twisting and writhing in the corners. I couldn't focus on any one thing without the sense of something else moving just out of sight. Then, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight movement from the corner of the room, but it caught my attention. I turned quickly, heart racing. A figure. A shadow. It was tall, no, impossibly tall, and it stood just inside the edge of the room where the darkness pooled. I couldn't make out its shape, only the vague outline of a human-like form, its edges blurred and shifting, as though it was more a distortion in space than a true being. I took a step back, my breath quickening. It was like staring into a void, no features, no details, just the absence of everything. And then the whispering stopped. I stood there, eyes locked on the figure that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the room. It didn't move. It didn't speak. But I felt it. The weight of its presence pressing in on me, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was trapped, caught in the space between the familiar and the unknown. And then, the figure moved. It didn't walk. It didn't step. It simply shifted, sliding toward me, its shape flickering in and out of focus as if it was uncertain of its own form. The air grew colder with each inch it came closer, until I could feel the frostbite of its presence on my skin. "Leave," the whisper came again, this time clear, sharp. It wasn't a question. It was an order. A command. I reached for the door, my hand shaking violently as I grabbed the handle. But before I could pull it open, the air seemed to solidify around me, like the very walls were pushing me back into the center of the room. My muscles screamed for me to move, but they wouldn't obey. I was stuck, frozen in place, trapped in a room that shouldn't exist, with a presence that shouldn't be there. The temperature dropped even further. My breath came out in invisible clouds. The shadows lengthened, creeping closer, surrounding me. They moved like liquid darkness, consuming the edges of the room until I couldn't see anything but blackness. "Don't go," the voice hissed again, this time from within my mind, as if it were speaking through me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight, to run. But I couldn't move. Then the door behind me clicked open. I spun around, desperate, heart hammering against my chest. The door was wide now, open into the hallway that had once been dark and quiet. But it wasn't the same hallway I remembered. It had changed. It was brighter now, filled with light, warm light. The oppressive shadows that had once lurked there were gone, replaced by an unsettling calm. The hall was inviting. Too inviting. The kind of calm that felt unnatural, like it was luring me into a trap. I couldn't move toward it. I couldn't move away. But the presence behind me was growing stronger. I could feel it right there, at my back. And yet, I knew I wasn't supposed to turn around. Not yet. I stood in the room, trembling. I had no choice. The door was open. But something in me told me that if I crossed the threshold, I might never return. And then, without warning, the floor beneath me shuddered. A deep, low rumble, like the entire building was waking up. The walls groaned. The ceiling cracked. The door slammed shut with a force so strong, I thought the hinges might break. It was too late. I was already inside, and the room that shouldn't have been there had swallowed me whole. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, so dense it felt as though I was trying to inhale water. My chest tightened with every panicked gasp, and every movement felt sluggish, as if the very space around me was pushing back. The room, once ordinary, had transformed into something alive. Something watching. The walls closed in around me. I could feel the pressure, the subtle vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The shadows in the corners moved, undulating like living things, and I could see them now, not just darkness, but shapes. Faint outlines, barely perceptible, but they were there. Moving, shifting. I turned, desperate for an escape, but the door was gone. It had vanished, as if it had never existed. The wall where it had been was solid, smooth, untouched. Panic surged through me, raw and wild. I pressed my palms against the cold surface of the wall, hoping for a crack, a seam, anything that would give way and let me out. But the surface was unyielding, almost like stone. The room was no longer just a space, it had become a trap, a cage with no way out. The whispers returned, this time louder, sharper. Their voices were clearer now, like 100 people speaking at once, all desperate, all pleading. "You shouldn't have come here. You can't leave. It's too late." Each voice twisted the air, turning it colder. I staggered back, my eyes darting around the room, looking for something, anything, that would make sense. But everything was wrong. The furniture, the bed, the nightstand, they were all there, just as I had seen them before. But they weren't real. They were just shadows of themselves, distorted in ways I couldn't understand. And then I saw it. In the farthest corner of the room, behind the bed, a dark shape was emerging. It wasn't like the shifting shadows I had seen before. This shape was solid, defined, and growing larger, stretching toward me like an arm reaching from the darkness. It was a figure, tall, thin, its edges flickering in and out of focus. It didn't have a face, just an empty void where its features should have been. The air grew colder still, a bone-deep chill that made me feel like I was being frozen from the inside. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed, my limbs unresponsive as the figure slowly advanced. It stopped just in front of me, its presence overwhelming, like a storm pressing down on everything. And then, in the silence that followed, a voice came. It wasn't the whispering chorus I had heard before. No. This voice was different. It was clear, calm, almost soothing. You never left. The words resonated in my mind, echoing through every part of my body. The figure, the room, it was all part of something I couldn't understand. Something I was trapped in. Something that had been waiting for me. The realization hit me like a wave, crashing over everything I thought I knew. The hallway, the one I had seen before, the one with the light, the inviting warmth, it wasn't real. It had never been real. It was just another illusion, another part of this nightmare. I had never left the room. I had thought I stepped into the hallway. I had thought I opened the door. But that wasn't the case. The room had changed me. It had manipulated the space around me, altered my perception of time and place. And now, it was taking me deeper. The figure before me moved closer, its absence of features making it all the more terrifying. It was like staring into an abyss, a void that swallowed everything. The longer I looked, the more I felt myself being drawn in, consumed by it. I tried to scream, tried to fight, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt dry, as if the air was suffocating me. And then, in a flash, it all stopped. The figure was gone. The room was still. The air, though thick, no longer pressed against me. I was alone again. But the silence, it was oppressive. It was waiting for something. I turned, searching for any sign of an exit, any crack in the walls, any hint of a way out. And there it was. The door. The one that had disappeared earlier. It was back. But it was different this time. It wasn't the same wooden door from before. No, this one was black, pitch black, with no markings, no number. But it was open. I moved toward it, almost instinctively. My steps were slow, cautious. I didn't know if this was a trick, if this was just another illusion designed to lure me in. But I had no choice. The room was pressing in again, and I had to get out. I crossed the threshold, and everything changed. The hallway was gone. The familiar, welcoming light was replaced with an unnatural glow, a sickly yellow hue that cast long, twisted shadows on the walls. The air felt heavier than before, like the space was closing in on me. There was no sound, no movement, just the oppressive silence. I looked around, desperate to find anything familiar. But I didn't recognize this place. The walls were cracked, peeling, stained with something that looked like blood. The floor creaked under my weight, and the ceiling seemed to bend unnaturally, as if the building itself was bowing under pressure. And then I heard it again. A whisper, faint but clear. "Welcome back." I froze. The voice, it wasn't coming from any one place. It seemed to come from everywhere, all around me, echoing through the hall. I looked over my shoulder, but the door had vanished again. I was alone, trapped once more. This wasn't the hotel I had entered. It wasn't even the same room. It was something else, something that had been waiting for me. And I realized, with a sickening certainty, that I might never leave. The walls were closing in again. But this time, I wasn't sure if I ever really escaped. And I was beginning to wonder if I ever would. The whisper grew louder, clearer, and with it, the overwhelming sense of being watched. The darkness around me twisted, pressing in from every angle. I tried to turn, to run, but each step I took seemed to carry me in a circle. I was moving, but I wasn't getting anywhere. The hallway stretched out before me, an endless corridor, the walls and the ceiling bending at impossible angles. I was trapped in some kind of nightmare that refused to let go. I could feel the presence again. That invisible weight pressing down on me, always just out of reach. I wasn't alone. My breath caught in my throat as I stopped. The cold air had returned, biting and suffocating, and I realized that the whispering had become a chant. "You're not supposed to be here." The words echoed like a warning, reverberating through the walls, through my very bones. I tried to push forward, my legs trembling with exhaustion, but the hallway seemed to stretch further and further, never ending. I could see the door again, now just ahead of me, but when I reached for it, it was always out of reach, sliding away just as I thought I had it. Every time I got close, the door was further down the hall. My mind began to break apart. I didn't know if this was real anymore. I didn't know if I was even still in the same hotel. The walls of the hallway were warped and disjointed, the windows blacked out, giving no view of the outside world. There was no escape. There never had been. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. My breath became visible, but it wasn't just the cold. The chill came with a presence, a wave of dread that clung to the air like fog. The whispers were louder now, sharper, more insistent. "Leave now. This is your fault." I stumbled backward, the ground beneath me shifting, warping as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. I turned again, desperate to find something familiar, but all I saw was the same distorted hallway, its dimensions twisting beyond reason. The door. The same door. I knew, with sickening certainty, that it would never open for me. No matter how many times I reached for it, no matter how many times I thought I had finally escaped, I would always come back here. To the same place. The same room. The same hallway. It wasn't a hotel. It wasn't a room. It was a trap. The walls began to close in on me again, the whispers louder now, almost deafening. I fell to my knees, unable to stop the overwhelming panic that seized my chest. I looked up, but the hallway was gone. The world around me was nothing but blackness, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw the shadowy figure again, the one that had haunted me from the start. It was there, standing just outside my vision, its form flickering, as if it was waiting for me to realize the truth. It wasn't going to let me leave. Not ever. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the suffocating darkness. The figure, the room, the whispers, they would never stop. I had been here before, I would be here again. The cycle would continue. But then, a quiet stillness. For the briefest moment, everything stopped. The whispers, the cold, the movement of the shadows. I opened my eyes, blinking against the darkness. The door. It was back. But it wasn't the same. It had no handle, no markings, no features at all. Just a black, solid surface. I didn't even know if I should touch it. But the urge to escape was too strong. I reached out. The moment my fingers brushed against the door, I felt it. The force pulling me in. The realization. The truth I had been avoiding. The room. The hallway. The hotel. It wasn't real. None of it had ever been real. This was the place I had been trapped in all along. The door had never been an exit. It had only ever been another trap, another illusion designed to keep me here, to keep me from remembering. I had never left the room. And now, I never would. The door opened. But beyond it, nothing awaited. No light. No escape. Just the endless, suffocating darkness. And I realized, in that moment, that this was my reality now. The loop. The cycle. I was part of it. And I would never be free. The door slammed shut behind me. And I stood in the dark, knowing that no matter how hard I tried to run, I would always be right back here, in the room that shouldn't exist. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you saw yourself in a place where you shouldn't exist? I didn't ask myself that question until I found myself standing at the edge of the lake. It wasn't the kind of question you think about in everyday life. But when the moment came, when I stood there on that quiet, forgotten trail deep in the woods, it suddenly seemed like the most important one I'd ever face. It had been a long day. The forest was dense, its towering trees forming a thick canopy that allowed only the faintest light to filter through. The air was cool, damp from the early morning mist that had yet to dissipate. Birds chirped in the distance, the only sound breaking the stillness. I had been walking for hours, just lost in my thoughts, looking for something, a sense of peace, maybe, or just a break from the relentless noise of the world. And then I found it. The lake. It wasn't on any map, not that I had been looking for it. It was just there, as if it had always been waiting for someone to stumble upon it. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the surrounding trees and the sky above in a way that seemed almost unnatural. The surface was like glass, clear and undisturbed. I took a step closer, drawn in by its eerie calmness. There was something magnetic about it, something that made me want to linger, even though I couldn't quite explain why. As I knelt down at the water's edge, I expected to see my reflection, to meet my own gaze in the mirror of the lake. But I didn't. The water was unnaturally still, but it didn't reflect me. It didn't reflect anything I recognized. Instead, there was someone else, someone standing at the far end of the lake, slowly making their way toward the shore. I blinked. My heart skipped a beat. Who was that? The figure was indistinct, their form shrouded in the mist that clung to the lake. They moved slowly, deliberately, as though they didn't have a care in the world. I could see their silhouette, tall, dark, and strangely familiar, but the details were missing. No face. No clothing. Just a shape, a shadow walking toward me. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Something about it didn't sit right. It wasn't just the oddity of seeing someone else where no one should be. It was the way they moved, the way they didn't belong in this place, this moment. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure continued to walk, unaffected by my presence, as if they hadn't noticed me at all. For a moment, I thought about turning back. But I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was like I was being pulled into their movement, trapped in some kind of silent dance between us. The sound of the water lapping at the shore was the only noise, but even that felt wrong. It was too soft, too deliberate, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. I took a step back, my gaze still locked on the figure, now much closer. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, thicker, like the atmosphere itself was pressing in. My breath quickened. Something was wrong. Something had changed. This wasn't just a lake anymore. It was something else. A place where the rules of the world no longer applied. I looked back at the water. The figure was still coming closer, but now, for the first time, I saw their face, or what I thought was their face. It was blank, empty, a smooth surface like the lake itself. Nothing. My heart stopped. I stumbled back, nearly falling into the water. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. The emptiness of their face, the lifelessness of their movement, it was as if they were part of the lake, an extension of it. And then, the figure stopped. Just a few feet from the water's edge, they paused, staring out over the lake, not at me, but at something deeper, something beneath the surface. Their presence felt heavy, suffocating. I didn't know how long I stood there, watching. The longer I looked, the more it seemed like the figure wasn't just standing there, they were waiting. Waiting for something. My breathing was shallow, my mind racing. I had to leave. I had to get away. The feeling in the pit of my stomach, that gnawing, overwhelming sense of dread, it was telling me I wasn't supposed to be here. But I didn't move. And then, with a suddenness that made my blood run cold, the figure began to step forward into the water. The lake rippled, but not in the way you'd expect. There were no waves. No movement of the surface. It was like the water bent around the figure, as if it were parting for them. That's when I realized. This wasn't just a person. It wasn't someone who had wandered into the woods like I had. This was something else. Something that didn't belong in this world. I turned and ran, my heart racing in my chest, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush of the forest. But even as I ran, I knew it wasn't enough. The figure would follow. The lake would never let me go. I reached the edge of the trees, but when I turned around, the lake was gone. Just the forest. Silent. Empty. Had I imagined it? Had I imagined the figure? The water? I didn't know. But one thing was certain. I would never return to that place. The lake without reflection was waiting for someone else. And the next time, it might be someone who never came back. I couldn't stop thinking about the lake. I should have left it behind, should have shaken off the terror that had gripped me as I ran. But the more I tried to forget it, the more vivid the memory became. It was as if the lake had planted itself in my mind, its image, its presence, lingering like a shadow I couldn't escape. I tried to push the thought aside, telling myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light and the mist. But there was a gnawing feeling at the back of my mind, an unease I couldn't ignore. The figure, the thing I had seen standing by the water, its empty face, its hollow eyes, kept haunting me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the stillness of the lake, felt the weight of its gaze on me. The figure in the water was still waiting. I knew it. Somewhere, deep in the forest, it was watching, waiting for me to return. But why? Why had I been there in the first place? What had drawn me to that lake? It wasn't like I was a person who sought out strange places or believed in myths. I was just walking, just trying to clear my head. But now it felt like the lake had called to me, lured me in. I knew I had to go back. It was the only way to understand what had happened. To figure out what that figure had wanted, what it had been trying to tell me. Or maybe it wasn't trying to tell me anything. Maybe it just wanted me to understand that there was something out there, something hidden, something that shouldn't exist. So, the next morning, with a sense of dread settled deep in my chest, I set out again. The forest looked the same as it had before, dense, silent, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth. But this time, it felt different. The weight of expectation was heavy on me. Every step I took seemed to echo louder in the stillness. The forest closed in around me, every shadow stretching unnaturally long. When I reached the lake, I was almost relieved to see that it was just as I remembered it, quiet, still, the water untouched by the wind. It was as if no time had passed since I'd last stood here, the surface of the lake reflecting the trees and sky, perfect and undisturbed. But something was different this time. The figure wasn't there. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, to believe that maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe it had just been a trick of my mind, a product of fear and exhaustion. But then, I noticed something else, something that shouldn't have been possible. The reflection in the lake wasn't mine. I leaned in closer, my breath catching in my throat. The image that stared back at me was not my own. It was another figure, the same one I had seen the day before, the person, or whatever it was, walking toward the shore. But now, it was not just an image. It was real. I could see it clearly, its form shifting, its movement fluid, almost like it was coming from the depths of the lake itself. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched it approach, step by slow step, its presence growing stronger, more undeniable. It was walking closer to me, its form solidifying with each movement. I stepped back, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It felt like I was trapped in its gaze, like it was drawing me in, pulling me closer. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I run? Should I scream? But what could I do? I wasn't sure if it was even real, or if I was just losing my mind. And then, it stopped. The figure paused, its shape becoming clearer, its form defined. But still, its face was blank, featureless, nothing but a smooth surface like the lake itself. It stared at me with an intensity that froze me in place. The lake rippled as if disturbed by the figure's presence, but the water didn't move in the way it should have. There was no wind, no breeze. It was as if the lake itself was breathing, shifting with each passing second. I took a step back, but I didn't feel like I was in control anymore. The moment I had crossed that threshold, when I had come back to the lake, I had already surrendered to whatever force this place was under. I was no longer just an observer. I was part of it now. I felt a wave of vertigo wash over me, a sudden dizziness as if the world was tilting, spinning. The figure was still staring, and as it did, something began to change. The water started to shift, swirling unnaturally. The figure, its form growing more solid, seemed to reach out toward me. I turned and ran. The sound of my footsteps in the dirt was deafening, but as I ran, I could still feel the pull of the lake, like invisible threads dragging me back. The woods were closing in around me, the trees growing taller, darker, more oppressive. I had to get away. But no matter how fast I ran, the lake was always there, looming in my mind. I ran for what felt like hours, until finally, I stumbled onto a path that led me back to civilization. The town was still a few miles away, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from the woods, from the lake. I didn't look back. But as I walked away, I heard it, the soft whisper of water lapping at the shore, distant but unmistakable. The lake was still there, waiting for me. And no matter how far I ran, it would always be just beyond reach. The figure in the water was waiting for me. It hadn't given up. It never would. I thought about the lake every day after that. The images haunted me, those empty, lifeless eyes of the figure that stared at me from the water. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling me back, that it was waiting for me to return. It felt like a compulsion, something deep inside me that I couldn't control. Even in the middle of my busy days, the thought of the lake would creep into my mind, unbidden, pulling me under like a weight, dragging me into the depths. I tried to ignore it. I went on with my life, focusing on work, on people around me, on anything that could keep my thoughts from straying back to that place. But it wasn't enough. The lake was never far away. And soon, I started to realize that ignoring it wasn't going to make it go away. It was like a slow burn, creeping through the cracks in my mind, becoming more intense the longer I resisted it. One night, after a long day at the office, I found myself walking without thinking, my feet carrying me down the same familiar road, away from the city and toward the woods. I hadn't planned it. I hadn't decided to return to the lake. But somehow, my body knew. It led me back there. The forest seemed darker this time. The trees were thicker, the shadows deeper. The air was colder, more oppressive. It felt wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. My heart raced, but I kept moving forward, step after step, the pull of the lake becoming impossible to ignore. When I reached the clearing, I hesitated. The lake was still there, just as it had been, its surface as smooth as glass, reflecting the sky above in perfect stillness. But there was something different this time. The figure wasn't there. It wasn't standing at the far end of the lake, waiting for me. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe the lake had released me, had finally let me go. But then, as I stood there, staring at the water, I felt a chill run through me. The reflection in the lake was mine. But there was something wrong with it. The reflection didn't move like I did. It stood still, unmoving, as if frozen in time. Its eyes, my eyes, were locked on me, but there was no emotion in them, no life. The reflection was lifeless, empty. It was like looking at a mirror that had stopped reflecting reality, caught in a moment that wasn't real. I stepped closer to the water, my heart pounding. The reflection didn't change. It didn't blink. It didn't look away. It was as if the lake had taken a part of me, trapped it inside. And then, I saw it. A figure appeared in the reflection. Slowly, like it was rising from the depths of the lake, it began to take shape. It was the same figure from before, the one that had been standing on the shore. But this time, it wasn't in the distance. It was right there, just behind my reflection, standing in the water, its face still empty, its form shifting. I froze. The figure wasn't looking at me. It was looking at the reflection. It was looking at the lifeless version of me, the one that wasn't moving, the one that was trapped in the water. I stepped back, but the figure in the reflection didn't move. It remained still, watching. And then, something changed. The water rippled, not from the wind, but from something else, something deeper. I heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, behind me. My blood ran cold. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I could feel it, though. The figure was no longer just in the reflection. It was here, behind me, standing at the water's edge. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen, as if it were caught in the same spell that held the reflection in place. My mind screamed for me to escape, but my body refused to obey. The footsteps came closer, the sound growing louder, closer with each passing second. It was just behind me now, standing at the edge of the water, and I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating. Then it spoke. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice at all. It was like a whisper from the depths of the earth, a voice made of water and wind and something darker. Come closer. The words echoed in my mind, reverberating through me. I didn't want to move. I couldn't. But somehow, my feet began to move on their own, as if the figure's words had power over me. I walked closer to the water, step by step, unable to stop myself. The reflection in the lake was still there, still lifeless, still unmoving. But now, I could feel the figure standing behind me, its presence so close I could almost touch it. Come closer, the voice whispered again. I stepped into the water. It was cold. Colder than anything I had ever felt. The water crept up my legs, numbing my skin. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't move away. The figure behind me was guiding me, pulling me toward it. I reached the center of the lake, the water up to my waist now. I could still hear the whisper, still feel the figure's presence. It was everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. And then, the figure in the reflection moved. It stepped out of the water. The reflection of me, lifeless, empty, was no longer still. It walked forward, step by step, mirroring my every movement. But there was one difference, it wasn't following me. It was walking toward the shore, toward the trees, toward freedom. I felt a pull, an unbearable force, dragging me toward the reflection. But I couldn't resist. I couldn't escape. And then, everything went dark. I woke up on the shore of the lake, lying on the cold, wet earth. The water was still. The figure was gone. But I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over. The lake had claimed me. And now, it was waiting for someone else. I didn't know how much time had passed since the lake had pulled me under. I woke up cold, shivering on the ground by the water's edge, as if I had been lying there for hours, maybe even days. The fog had thickened, swirling around me like it was alive, and the trees seemed to loom larger than before, their twisted branches reaching out toward the sky. The forest felt suffocating, like it was closing in on me, pushing me deeper into its shadows. But I wasn't alone. I could feel the presence of something watching me, lurking just out of sight. My heart raced as I slowly sat up, glancing around the clearing. The water of the lake was still, its surface a mirror that reflected the darkening sky, the trees, and nothing more. No figure. No reflection of myself. Just emptiness. But that feeling, the one I couldn't shake, the feeling of being watched, was still there, pressing against me, heavy and suffocating. I stood up shakily, my legs unsteady beneath me, and took a few cautious steps back from the water. I couldn't stay here any longer. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else I couldn't quite place, something metallic, almost like blood. I turned away from the lake, my eyes scanning the trees around me. The woods were eerily silent, but there was something beneath the silence, a subtle hum in the air that made my skin crawl. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. I wasn't just lost in the forest anymore. I was caught between two worlds. The one I had come from, the one that felt distant and unreal now, and the other, the one where the lake lived, where the figure waited. Where I had been. The ground beneath me shifted as I walked, as if the earth itself was unstable, like it was pulling me deeper into the soil, trying to drag me back. I stumbled forward, my breath shallow, my pulse racing. Every step felt like a battle against an unseen force, pushing against me, urging me to go back to the lake. I forced myself to keep moving, ignoring the overwhelming sensation that something was following me. But when I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing there. Just trees. Just the silent, oppressive forest. I didn't understand. I didn't understand why the lake had chosen me, why it was still here in my mind, pulling at me like a magnet. Why couldn't I just leave it behind? I had to get out of here. I moved faster, pushing through the underbrush, hearing the sound of twigs snapping under my feet. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, its paths winding and confusing, like it had no end. My sense of time was slipping away, every minute blending into the next as if I were trapped in a loop. The trees seemed to bend toward me, the branches creaking, almost as if they were trying to reach out and grab me. And then I heard it. A voice. Soft at first, barely a whisper. But it grew louder, clearer, until it echoed through the trees. The words were indistinguishable, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the same voice I had heard by the lake. The voice that had called to me, that had pulled me toward the water. Come closer. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest as the voice called again, louder now, more insistent. Come closer. You are part of me. Come closer. I felt the air grow colder, the very temperature around me dropping. My breath came out in a visible cloud, my body trembling in the growing chill. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away from this, but I couldn't move. The voice held me in place, like invisible chains wrapped around my limbs, keeping me rooted to the spot. Come closer. I wanted to scream, to break free, but I was paralyzed. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the trees around me, from the dark spaces between the trunks where someone was waiting. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow moving too quickly between the trees. But as it came closer, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was the figure. The same one from the lake. Its shape was distorted, flickering in and out of focus, like it wasn't entirely solid. Its form shimmered and shifted as it moved toward me, its presence more oppressive with each step. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But I couldn't. The figure was close now, just a few feet away. I could see it clearly. Its face was still featureless, smooth and blank, but its eyes, they weren't blank anymore. They were there, staring at me. Eyes that were mine, eyes that were dark, cold, and hollow. I could feel it in my chest, the suffocating pressure of its gaze, like it was pulling at my very soul. Come closer. The voice was everywhere now, inside my head, inside my body, vibrating through my bones. I was drowning in it, in its call. I wanted to scream, to break free, but I was paralyzed, trapped by the figure, trapped by the lake that had claimed me. And then it reached out. Its hand, no, its fingers were long, too long, impossibly long, stretching toward me. The air around me grew thick with a presence that I couldn't escape, that I couldn't fight. The figure's hand hovered inches from my face, its fingers curling, beckoning me. Come closer. The ground beneath me began to give way, crumbling, as if the earth itself was pulling me into it. I could feel the dirt, the roots, the earth, all pulling me down, dragging me deeper into the ground. I was sinking, unable to move, unable to fight against the force that was overwhelming me. The figure's fingers touched my skin. And in that instant, everything went black. I woke up, gasping for air, the cold grip of the lake's presence still clutching at me. I was on the ground again, not by the lake this time, but in a place I didn't recognize. The trees were gone, replaced by a vast, empty landscape stretching on forever. But I could still hear the voice. It was close, louder now. "Welcome home." I stumbled to my feet, my legs trembling as I looked around, trying to make sense of the landscape that stretched out before me. The ground beneath me felt wrong, soft, almost like it wasn't real. The air was thick with the same oppressive atmosphere that had clung to the lake, but now it was even heavier, more suffocating. The world around me felt like it was suspended in a dream, unreal, twisted. I wasn't sure where I was. The place was familiar, yet alien. The trees, the sky, they all looked like they belonged to this world, but something was off. There was a stillness in the air, a silence that pressed down on me like a weight, broken only by the faint hum in the distance. The hum that seemed to be calling me, pulling me forward, urging me to move. But I didn't want to move. I didn't want to go toward whatever was drawing me deeper into this strange place. The pull was so strong, so undeniable, but I fought against it. I couldn't give in. Not after everything that had happened. I had to escape. And then I saw it. A shape in the distance, something far away but unmistakable. The lake. The water stretched out like a vast mirror, its surface shimmering in the dull light. The lake was no longer a distant memory, a place I had left behind. It was here, right in front of me. I couldn't comprehend how or why, but it was there, waiting. As I moved closer, my steps hesitant, the hum grew louder, vibrating through my chest. I could feel it in my bones. It was like the lake itself was alive, breathing, waiting. The reflection in the water was distorted, as if it had been stretched and pulled out of shape, and yet, in that disfigured surface, I saw something, someone standing by the water. It was me. Or rather, it was a version of me. The reflection was twisted, like a distorted mirror image, but I knew it was me. The eyes were wrong, dark and hollow, and the face was contorted into something that wasn't quite human. I stared at it, horrified, as the reflection stared back. And then, the reflection moved. It stepped forward from the water, just as the figure had done before. But this time, it wasn't the figure from the woods. It was me. It was my reflection, stepping out of the lake, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it wasn't quite sure how to move, how to exist outside of the water. It looked at me. The same hollow eyes. The same face. But this time, I felt a wave of dread flood over me. This wasn't just a reflection. It wasn't just an image in the water. It was something else. Something I couldn't understand. Something that had crossed over from the lake, from that other world I had been trapped in. "Come closer," the reflection whispered, its voice a low, raspy echo of my own. I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot, my body frozen in place. The figure, no, the reflection, continued to approach, its eyes locked on me. The closer it got, the more I could feel the darkness surrounding it, like it was pulling me in. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. The reflection reached out its hand, its fingers long and twisted, stretching toward me. Its touch felt cold, unnatural, like ice scraping against my skin. And then, something inside me snapped. I couldn't stay in this place any longer. I couldn't let this thing, this twisted version of me, touch me, pull me back into the darkness. I turned and ran. The ground beneath me seemed to shift with every step, as if it was trying to trip me, slow me down. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The hum in the air grew louder, like 1,000 voices calling to me, urging me to turn back, to surrender. But I refused to listen. The trees blurred past me, the landscape twisting and warping as I ran, as if the world itself was bending, trying to hold me in place. But I wouldn't stop. I wouldn't let it take me again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of running, I broke through the trees, stumbling into a clearing. And there it was again. The lake. It was just ahead of me, its surface as still as ever, reflecting the sky, the trees, the clouds. It was exactly the same as it had been when I first saw it, when I first stood by its edge, looking into the water. But I knew better now. This wasn't a place I could escape. It wasn't just a lake. It was a door, a portal between worlds, between realities. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried to escape, it would always pull me back. The reflection in the water shifted. It wasn't my own face anymore. It was something else, something unfamiliar, but deeply unsettling. It was as if the lake was showing me something that wasn't supposed to be seen, something hidden beneath the surface, something that had been waiting for me. The figure stepped forward again, this time emerging fully from the water, its body slick with wetness, its eyes still locked on mine. And then, in a voice that was no longer my own, it spoke. "Welcome home." The world around me twisted, distorted, and everything faded to black. And in the darkness, I understood. I wasn't leaving. I was the lake now. Have you ever heard a voice from the dark? One that you can't explain, that seems to come from nowhere, but somehow speaks to you directly, calling you by name? What would you do if you heard it, knowing that whatever it wasn't normal, and yet you couldn't help but listen? It started with a sound. At first, I thought I had imagined it. It was soft, barely audible, like the wind brushing through the trees, but it carried something more. Something personal. I had heard it near the old well behind my house, a crumbling stone structure that had been forgotten for years. People said it was just an old well, nothing more. But there was something about it that always unsettled me. Something about the way it stood alone in the overgrown field, its dark, hollow mouth staring back at me. That evening, as I walked back from the woods, the voice came again, faint, like a whisper threading through the wind. My name. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't urgent. Just a soft, deliberate call, as if it knew exactly how to get my attention. Peter. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I looked around, my breath quickening. No one was in sight. The woods were empty, the twilight air thick with silence, except for the soft rustling of the leaves. I glanced toward the well. The voice had come from there. But I couldn't see anyone. It was just the well, standing there, like always. A simple hole in the ground. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It had to be my imagination, or maybe just the wind. But then it came again. Peter, come closer. The words seemed to vibrate through me, making my skin tingle with an uneasy cold. My breath hitched. This was no longer just the wind. There was something alive in that voice, something that made me feel like it was pulling at the very core of me, tugging me toward the well. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't. The curiosity inside me was overwhelming. What was it? Who was it? And why was it calling me? Was it real, Or was it just a figment of my tired mind playing tricks on me? My feet moved of their own accord, taking slow, hesitant steps toward the well. With each step, the voice grew louder, clearer, more distinct. It was still a whisper, but it was now unmistakably human. Almost familiar, though I couldn't place it. The sound seemed to wrap around me, enveloping me, coaxing me closer. Peter, you have to see. You have to know. I stood at the edge of the well, staring down into the inky darkness. The air felt colder here, heavier, like it was pressing in on me. The world around me seemed to blur, the trees and sky fading into the background as my eyes fixed on the black abyss below. I could almost feel the pull, like an invisible hand tugging at my chest. The hairs on my neck stood on end. The voice had stopped now, but I could still hear it in my mind, echoing. It was as if the well itself was speaking to me, calling me to come closer, to see what was hidden in the dark. My hands trembled as I leaned over the edge, peering into the depths. But all I could see was darkness. No shape, no form, just the empty void of the well. And then I heard it again. Peter, come down. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was clear, urgent. My heart raced. I couldn't tear myself away. Something inside me wanted to know, to find out what was down there, what was calling me. I looked around one last time. The world was quiet. The trees were still, the field empty. I was alone. There was no one watching, no one to stop me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My mind screamed for me to leave, to walk away and forget it. But my feet took another step forward, closer to the well. I reached down, gripping the old rope that hung loosely by the side, and without thinking, I began to lower myself into the darkness below. As my feet left the ground, the world above me seemed to fade away. The sounds of the wind, the rustling of the trees, the quiet hum of the night, it all disappeared, replaced by an oppressive silence. The air grew colder, heavier, and the deeper I descended, the more the darkness seemed to close in around me. The rope creaked under my weight, groaning as I lowered myself further, inch by inch. Peter, the voice called again, this time right below me, its tone almost tender. You're almost there. I paused. The sound was so close now, as if the voice was right beneath me, within the very walls of the well. It filled my ears, vibrating through my bones. I could feel it in my chest, the words sinking into my skin like a touch. I didn't know what awaited me at the bottom. But the voice, that calm, soothing voice, told me I had to keep going. Just one more step. The darkness below seemed endless. And as I descended, I realized that the voice was no longer a sound coming from the well. It was coming from inside my mind. And then, the rope snapped. Have you ever heard a voice when you were completely alone? Not on the phone, not from the TV, but from somewhere you couldn't explain? That's how it started for me. A voice calling my name, deep from the well in the old backyard. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but it kept happening over and over until I could no longer ignore it. I live in an old house at the edge of a quiet town, surrounded by overgrown trees and fields. My house was built long ago, and so was the well. It had been abandoned for years, the stones crumbling and the wood rotting, but it stood there like a scar on the land, untouched by time. I always tried to avoid it, but it was impossible not to notice. Its deep, dark mouth sat in the middle of the yard, a silent reminder of things I didn't want to think about. The first time I heard it, I was sitting on the porch, watching the fading light of evening turn into darkness. The sound was soft at first, barely noticeable, just a whisper in the wind. My name. Mark. I froze, heart pounding. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the wind, maybe the rustling of branches that sounded like words. But then, it happened again. Mark. I looked out at the well, but there was nothing there. Nothing moving, nothing unusual. The wind had stopped. The trees stood still. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling to me, something from the depths of the earth itself. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a cold chill running down my spine. I stood up, unable to help myself, and walked toward the well. My footsteps were the only sound in the silent air. The closer I got, the more the voice seemed to grow, but it was still faint, like it was just on the edge of my hearing. Mark, it whispered, just loud enough to make my blood run cold. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the darkness of the well. The air around me felt heavier, thicker, like the earth itself was breathing, waiting. The voice came again, clearer this time. Mark, come closer. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but I could feel something in the way it called me, something familiar, something that made me feel as though I should listen. It wasn't until that moment, standing at the edge of that dark hole, that I realized I had never heard this voice before. And yet, it felt so personal, like it was meant just for me. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. What was this? Why was it calling me? I turned away, but the voice didn't stop. It only grew louder, insistent, pulling at me. Mark, it repeated, more urgent this time. You have to come. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that was clouding my thoughts. I didn't want to go any closer, didn't want to be near that well, that cursed place. But the voice, there was something in it that felt almost comforting. Like it knew me, like it needed me. Something about it made me want to go down, to see what lay at the bottom, what was waiting for me. I took a step forward. Then another. Each step felt like I was being pulled deeper into something I couldn't understand. My feet were moving before my mind could even catch up. The closer I got, the stronger the voice became, louder and more frantic. Come to me, it said, now almost a command. My heart raced, but my feet wouldn't stop moving. I reached the edge of the well and looked down. The darkness inside seemed endless, a pit that went on forever. I couldn't see the bottom. I couldn't see anything at all. But the voice, it came from there, from deep within that blackness. And it was still calling to me. I knelt down, peering over the edge, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Mark, the voice whispered again, but this time it was right below me. It was as if it was waiting for me, as if it knew I was close enough now, close enough to listen, close enough to fall. Without thinking, I reached out. My fingers brushed the edge of the well, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The voice seemed to hold its breath, waiting. My hand shook, and my heart pounded louder than I thought possible. I wanted to pull away, to run back to the safety of my house, but I didn't. I stayed there, hanging over the well, listening, waiting for the next sound. And then it came. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, a rustle, followed by a whisper. Come down, it said. And that's when I knew, deep down in my bones, that I had to go down. I didn't understand why, but I couldn't fight it any longer. The voice, the pull, it was all too much. I stood, took a deep breath, and, without another thought, I reached down to grab the old rope tied to the well's edge. I had no idea what waited for me at the bottom, but I had to find out. As my fingers gripped the rough, fraying rope, I hesitated for only a moment. The voice, now a steady hum in my mind, urged me forward, pushing all doubts aside. It felt like an inevitability, like I had been drawn here for this moment, for this very descent. The air around the well felt thick, pressing in on me from all sides. I exhaled slowly, the darkness in front of me swallowing up every trace of light. With a final, deep breath, I stepped off the ground and began to lower myself into the well. The rope creaked under my weight, and the descent was slow at first, almost unbearably slow. The walls of the well pressed in, narrowing as I went deeper, the rough stones scraping against my fingers as I descended. The cold, damp air of the well enveloped me, and a strange unease settled in my stomach. I had never felt anything like it before, like something was watching me, waiting. As I sank deeper, the ground seemed to shift beneath me. My hands clenched tighter on the rope, and my heart raced in my chest. The voice grew louder now, as if it were echoing off the stone walls of the well, reverberating in my skull. Almost there, it whispered, soft and insistent. I kept my eyes on the darkness below, refusing to look up. The further I went, the more intense the feeling became. Something was wrong, something was very wrong. But I couldn't stop now. My body, my mind, they were all being drawn into the depths, as if I had no choice in the matter. And then, without warning, the rope jerked violently, sending a shock through my body. I gasped, my grip slipping for a brief moment, but I regained control and hung on tight. I glanced down, squinting into the blackness. The voice was silent now, but I could feel its presence growing stronger, more tangible. It was close. The rope kept jerking, pulling me down faster. My feet scraped against the cold stone, the deepening pit threatening to swallow me whole. Panic surged in my chest as I realized I was no longer in control. The well was pulling me, dragging me deeper, and no matter how hard I tried to stop, my body refused to obey. Mark. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was clear now, crisp and piercing, reverberating through the very walls of the well. You're almost here. The bottom of the well seemed to stretch out before me, an endless abyss that threatened to swallow me whole. And yet, I couldn't look away, couldn't stop myself from continuing the descent. Every instinct in my body screamed to turn back, to climb up and away from the darkness, but I was helpless. The pull was too strong. Finally, my feet touched something solid, something that wasn't the stone walls of the well. My body jolted, and I stepped down, unsure of what I was standing on. The ground beneath me was soft, uneven, but it held firm, like wet earth. I took a cautious step forward, my heart racing, the voice still echoing in my ears. It was louder now, as though it was all around me, no longer coming from above, but from the very air itself. You're here, it said, its tone now chillingly sweet. Welcome. I looked around, but all I could see was a thick fog that clung to the ground, swirling in the darkness. I could barely make out shapes, twisted shadows that shifted and writhed, but I couldn't focus on them long enough to understand what they were. My senses felt overwhelmed by the fog, my breath shallow as I struggled to keep my composure. I called out into the darkness, my voice barely a whisper. Who are you? What do you want from me? The voice didn't answer immediately. Instead, I felt a presence behind me, cold and heavy, pressing against me from all directions. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The fog seemed to part for a moment, revealing only the same endless blackness, the same twisted shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Don't be afraid, the voice said softly. You came here for a reason. I took another step, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. The air was thick with a strange, suffocating energy, and every part of me screamed that I was not alone. That whatever was here, whatever had called me, was not something I could escape. And then, out of the fog, I saw it. A figure. At first, it was just a shape, a silhouette in the mist, but as it drew closer, I could make out details, tall, with a long cloak that seemed to billow unnaturally in the stagnant air. Its face was hidden, a shadow beneath a hood, but I could feel its eyes on me, sharp and cold. Why did you come? The figure asked, its voice low and disembodied, as if it were speaking not from its mouth, but from somewhere deep within my mind. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The weight of the situation was suffocating, and I couldn't bring myself to speak. What had I done? What had I allowed myself to be drawn into? The figure took a step forward, its form dissolving into the mist. You wanted to know, it said, its voice now a mere whisper, just a breath in the darkness. But some things are better left unknown. Before I could react, I felt something pull at me again, a force that was both gentle and forceful at the same time. My body moved against my will, and I stumbled forward, caught in the grip of something far beyond my control. The figure, the voice, everything around me seemed to shift, and suddenly, I was no longer standing in the well. I was somewhere else. The world around me was dark, twisted, and unfamiliar. And I realized, with a sinking feeling in my chest, that there was no way out. Not anymore. I staggered, my legs weak beneath me, the weight of what I had just experienced pressing down on my chest. The air was thick here, heavier than before, and the oppressive silence was louder than any sound could ever be. The fog swirled around me, curling and twisting like living smoke. It was as though I had stepped into a different realm, one that existed outside of time and space. The figure, no, it wasn't just a figure anymore, had vanished into the mist. I tried to make sense of the surroundings, but the more I looked, the more distorted everything became. The trees were bent at unnatural angles, their branches twisted like gnarled hands reaching out for me. The ground was soft, almost like it was made of some thick, wood material that shifted with every step. I turned around, hoping to find some familiar trace of a well, but there was nothing. No rope, no opening in the earth. Only an endless expanse of fog and twisted trees. The voice, that familiar voice, still echoed in my mind, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from anymore. It felt like it was everywhere, surrounding me, whispering my name like a lullaby. Mark. It crooned again. You've crossed over now. I froze at the sound of my name. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned quickly, scanning the fog for the source. But there was nothing, no one. Why am I here? I called out, my voice shaking. What do you want from me? The voice didn't answer. Instead, the silence grew thicker, denser. It pressed against my ears, blocking out any other sound. I took another step forward, my mind racing. Was this real? Or was I losing my grip on reality? Then, something shifted in the fog. A shadow moved, a figure emerging from the mist. Unlike the first one, this one was different. It was hunched, almost animalistic, its movements jerky and erratic. I could barely make out its shape through the fog, but I could feel it, its presence. Something ancient, something wrong. The figure stopped and tilted its head, as though it was studying me. I could feel its gaze boring into me, like it could see inside my soul. It let out a low, guttural growl, and then, without warning, it lunged at me. My instincts kicked in, and I scrambled back, my feet slipping on the soft, shifting ground. But the creature was faster. It reached out with long, clawed hands, grabbing my arm with an iron grip. Pain shot through me as it dug its claws into my skin. I gasped and fought against its hold, twisting my body in an attempt to break free. But the creature's strength was overwhelming, and I felt myself being dragged closer. Its breath was hot against my face, its voice a harsh, rasping whisper. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed. "Now you belong here." Panic flooded my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The creature's claws dug deeper, and I could feel something cold creeping into my veins, a numbing sensation spreading through my arm. I looked down, and for a moment, I thought I saw something otherworldly in its eyes, a reflection of something dark and impossible. "Let go of me!" I screamed, my voice raw. But the creature didn't respond. It only continued to drag me further into the mist, toward the heart of whatever this place was. My mind screamed for escape, but my body was too weak to move. Suddenly, just as I thought I couldn't take any more, a flash of light pierced the fog. It was bright, blindingly so, and it pushed the darkness back for a moment. The creature hissed, its grip loosening just slightly. I took advantage of the moment and yanked my arm free, stumbling backward. The light grew brighter, and I saw the figure of a man standing ahead, his features obscured by the brilliance surrounding him. He raised a hand, and the creature recoiled, its growls subsiding into nothing. "Stay away from him," the man's voice rang out, deep and commanding. I didn't know who this man was, or where he had come from, but his presence gave me a small measure of hope. The creature backed away, retreating into the mist, its glowing eyes still watching me. I took a few shaky steps toward the man, my breath still ragged. "What is this place? Where am I?" The man didn't immediately answer. Instead, he looked at me, his expression unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice soft but firm. "You've crossed into the threshold," he said, as if that explained everything. "This place is not meant for you. Not for anyone from the other side." "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the folds of his cloak and pulled out a small, glowing object. It was a pendant hanging from a delicate chain. The light from it was warm and comforting, a stark contrast to the cold, twisted world around us. "You need to leave," he said finally. "Now, before it's too late." I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. "Leave? How?" He stepped forward, his eyes locking with mine. "You're not meant to be here, Mark. You've been called, yes, but it's not for what you think. The well is a doorway, a connection. But once you're through, there's no going back. You can never truly leave." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. I was starting to understand, but I didn't want to. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't real. "You don't have much time," he warned, his tone urgent. "The longer you stay, the more you will be pulled in. This place, it feeds on the living. And it's hungry." Before I could respond, the pendant flickered and dimmed, its light fading. The fog began to close in again, the air growing colder. I looked around, panic setting in once more. "What do I do?" I whispered, desperate. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began to walk into the mist, disappearing from sight. I stood there, alone again, the weight of his words crashing down on me. The fog began to thicken, the shadows moving once more. And I realized, with growing horror, that the danger was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The fog had thickened, swirling around me, and the shadows felt like they were closing in, suffocating me. I tried to make sense of everything, but the more I thought about it, the less clear it became. The man, whoever he was, had disappeared into the mist, and I was alone again, standing on the edge of some forsaken place. My eyes scanned the darkness, searching for anything that might lead me out of here, but all I saw were the twisted shapes of trees, the jagged silhouettes of rocks, and the unrelenting fog. The voice, the one that had called my name, was still there, echoing in my mind. "Mark." It whispered again, more faintly now, as if it was coming from far away. But I could feel it, like a hand on my shoulder, warm and cold all at once. I shuddered at the thought of it. With no other choice, I began walking. My footsteps were slow, hesitant, each one sinking into the soft, wet ground with a sickening squelch. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but every time I turned, there was nothing, only the fog, thick and oppressive. It felt like I was walking deeper into the heart of some ancient, forgotten place, a world that had been left behind by time itself. As I moved forward, I began to hear something. A faint, rhythmic sound, almost like a distant heartbeat. It was too steady, too deliberate to be random. And as I walked, the sound grew louder, closer, until it became impossible to ignore. It was like the earth itself was pulsing, the very ground beneath my feet alive with some dark energy. I looked around, trying to pinpoint the source, but the fog made everything indistinct. The trees around me seemed to shift and sway, their shapes bending in ways that didn't make sense. The mist rolled in thicker, and the shadows grew darker, as if something was emerging from within them. I quickened my pace, heart racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be. But then, ahead of me, I saw it, a figure. At first, it was just a shape, faintly outlined in the mist. But as I drew closer, it became clearer. The figure was tall, its outline jagged, distorted, like something trying to mimic the shape of a person but failing. Its arms were unnaturally long, hanging at its sides like limp ropes. The face, if it could be called that, was a blank, featureless mask of smooth, pale skin. The sound, the heartbeat, the pulsing ground, all of it stopped. The silence was unbearable. I wanted to turn and run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, rooted to the spot. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, its eyes, if it had eyes, burning into me, like it was searching through me, reading every part of my soul. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, as I tried to speak. Who are you?" My voice came out in a whisper, barely audible over the crushing silence. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if contemplating my question, or perhaps trying to understand why I was there. It took a step toward me, and then another, its movement eerily slow, like it had all the time in the world. "Mark." The voice whispered again, only this time it wasn't in my mind. It was coming from the figure's mouth. But it wasn't the same voice. This one was darker, colder, the tone distorted, as though it was struggling to hold on to its humanity. Before I could react, the figure reached out toward me with one of its long, skeletal hands. Its fingers were thin, too long, and the nails were black, sharp like claws. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. The hand was inches from my face when I felt a sudden surge of cold, an icy wave that seemed to pour from the creature itself. It wasn't just cold, it was emptiness. A cold that drained the warmth from my skin, the life from my bones. "Leave," it hissed, its voice now a low growl, like something scraping against stone. "This place is not for you. You belong to it now." The words echoed in my mind as though they were being spoken by something far away. A feeling of dread, a sense of utter hopelessness, flooded me. I knew, without a doubt, that whatever this thing was, it had no intention of letting me leave. My heart raced, the blood pounding in my ears. But still, I stood motionless, as though the creature's very presence had paralyzed me. The hand moved closer, its fingers outstretched, and in that moment, I could see the true nature of the thing before me. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a creature from the world I knew. It was something else, something ancient, something wrong. And then, just as it was about to touch me, I heard it again, the voice. But this time, it wasn't the voice of the figure or the voice I had heard before. This was a new voice, one filled with fear, with desperation. "Mark." The cry was clear, sharp. "Get out of there. Now." It was the man, the one who had tried to warn me. His voice cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and filled with urgency. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it didn't matter. His words ignited something inside me, a primal need to survive. I pulled away, my feet moving on their own, and I ran. The creature's hand brushed against my arm, and for a split second, I felt the cold, the emptiness, consume me. But I kept running, stumbling through the fog, not daring to look back. Behind me, I could hear the creature growling, its footsteps following. But I didn't dare stop. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't afford to slow down. The fog parted, and I saw the well in the distance. My heart leapt. It was real, it had to be. The entrance. The way out. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The well wasn't where it had been before. The stones around it were cracked, and the ground was uneven, like the earth itself had shifted. The fog was closing in again, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. The creature was closer now, its form distorted in the mist. I could hear its raspy breathing, its growl growing louder. It was too late. I wasn't going to make it out. I reached the edge of the well, panic surging through me. I turned, desperate, but there was nothing left, just the endless fog, the looming presence of the creature, and the terrible knowledge that I was trapped. It was over. I could feel the cold creeping up my spine as I stood at the edge of the well. My heart was pounding in my chest, drowning out the sounds around me. I wanted to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the thick, suffocating fog. The creature was close now, too close. Its presence was overwhelming, like the weight of the world pressing down on me. I turned, my mind racing. There had to be something I could do. There had to be a way out. My eyes darted around frantically, searching for anything that could give me a chance to escape. But the fog had closed in completely now. It felt like I was in a tomb, the air thick and damp, the ground soft and yielding beneath my feet. I reached out to steady myself against the well, but as my fingers brushed the stone, I felt something strange, something not quite solid, like the surface was alive. A low, guttural growl echoed through the fog, and I knew the creature was right behind me. It was only a matter of seconds before it would reach me, its cold fingers wrapping around my throat, pulling me into whatever hell it had come from. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was run. I turned and ran blindly, my footsteps muffled by the thick mist. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. All that mattered was putting distance between me and that thing. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape it. The growling seemed to follow me, reverberating in the very air around me. It was everywhere. It was all around me. I stumbled and fell, my knees scraping against the wet earth. I didn't even feel the pain. I was too consumed by fear, by the realization that I was trapped in some nightmarish version of reality, one that was closing in on me from all sides. And then, there was a shift. The growl stopped. The mist cleared just enough for me to see the shape of the well again, standing at the center of the fog like some twisted monument to despair. But something was different this time. The figure was no longer behind me. It was in front of me. I froze. The creature stood at the edge of the well, its form now fully visible in the dim light. It was no longer a distorted shadow, but something unmistakable, something that made my blood run cold. It was human, or at least it had once been. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over bones, and its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to pull me in. The mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, its teeth sharp, jagged. "Mark." The voice rasped again, low and menacing. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was real. It was right in front of me. I backed away, my mind scrambling for some way to escape, but the creature didn't move. It just stood there, watching me with those black, empty eyes. The mist around us thickened once more, and I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. The earth groaned, as though it was alive. "Mark," it repeated, its voice now dripping with malice. "You belong here." I couldn't move. My legs refused to respond, my body numb with terror. The creature took a step forward, its long arms reaching out, fingers twitching as if to grasp me. My heart raced, and in a panic, I turned and sprinted again, my feet slipping in the wet ground. But I didn't get far. The creature's hand shot out, fast and impossibly long, grabbing hold of my ankle. It yanked me back with terrifying strength, sending me crashing to the ground. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air around me felt thick, choking me, as though the fog itself was trying to smother me. I struggled, kicking, trying to break free, but the grip on my ankle tightened, and the creature pulled me closer. Its face was inches from mine now, its breath cold and rancid. "You cannot leave," it whispered, its voice like the scraping of nails on a chalkboard. And then, something strange happened. I felt it, something pulling at me, not from the creature, but from somewhere deeper, from the well itself. A force, an energy, calling to me. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and the well began to glow with an eerie, pale light. The creature didn't notice. It was too focused on me, too consumed by its desire to claim me. But I could feel the pull now, stronger than ever, urging me to move, to escape. With everything I had left, I kicked the creature's hand off my ankle. It hissed, a sound of pure fury, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward the glowing well. The pull grew stronger, like a magnetic force drawing me in. I reached the edge of the well and looked down into the abyss. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything. The creature's growl echoed from behind, but the pull from the well was too strong now. It was as if the well itself was calling me, inviting me into its depths. Without thinking, I jumped. The world seemed to twist around me, the fog fading away, the ground dissolving beneath my feet. I fell deeper and deeper into the void, the light from above growing dimmer, until all I could see was darkness. I could hear the creatures screeching in the distance, growing fainter as I descended. And then everything went silent. The darkness was complete. I didn't know where I was or what had happened to me. But I could feel it, the cold, the emptiness surrounding me. The pole was gone. The creature was gone. Everything was gone. And then, as if in response to my thoughts, I heard it. The voice. The same voice that had called my name from the depths of the well. Mark. But it wasn't the creature's voice. It was mine. I was home. But not the home I had known. This place, whatever it was different. It was just as dark, just as empty. And I realized, in that moment, that I was never going to leave. It's strange how the world around us can change without any warning. One moment, everything is familiar, and the next, it feels like you've stepped into a completely different place. Have you ever walked down a street and suddenly realized that you've never seen it before, even though you're sure you've been here countless times? That's what happened to me that day. It had been snowing heavily, and the entire city was blanketed in a thick, white layer of snow. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the soft crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. I had no real destination, just wandering through the familiar streets, trying to clear my mind. The cold air stung my face, and the quiet beauty of the snow-covered city gave me a strange sense of peace. But then, I saw it. A street that I was certain hadn't been there before. It was narrow, almost hidden from view, wedged between two tall, old buildings that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. The street was completely covered in snow, untouched by the usual foot traffic. I paused, squinting at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The street looked wrong. The air around it felt heavier, colder. There was a faint, unsettling feeling hanging over it, as though it didn't belong in this world. But curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I was walking down the street, the soft crunch of snow under my boots the only sound in the silence. I shouldn't have gone down that street. At first, everything seemed normal. The buildings on either side were dark, old, their windows covered in layers of frost. But the deeper I walked, the stranger things became. The snow started to fall harder, and the path became increasingly difficult to see, as if the world was fading into a fog of white. I stopped for a moment and turned back, only to find that the street behind me had vanished. The familiar buildings, the landmarks that I knew so well, were gone. All that remained was the endless stretch of snow, stretching out into the white abyss ahead of me. Panic started to rise in my chest. I turned again, hoping to find some way out, but the street seemed to stretch on forever. The air grew colder, and I felt a chill creeping down my spine, making my bones ache. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. It echoed, but no one answered. The further I walked, the more the world around me felt wrong. The street was changing. The buildings were shifting in strange, impossible ways. The walls seemed to move, growing taller and more twisted, as if they were alive. The snow was no longer soft underfoot, but hard, icy, and unforgiving. I tried to retrace my steps, but it was impossible. The street seemed to warp, twisting and bending, always just out of reach. The feeling of being lost, of being trapped, grew stronger with every step I took. And then, I heard something. At first, it was faint, just a whisper on the wind. But it grew louder, clearer. A voice. Someone, something, was calling my name. I froze. It was a soft, chilling sound, barely audible over the howling wind. But it was unmistakable. It was my name, being whispered, pulled from the depths of the snow and the silence. Mark. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, as though the very air had turned to ice around me. The voice called again, this time closer, more urgent. Mark. I forced myself to turn, but there was no one there. Only the snow, the endless expanse of white stretching in every direction. But the voice, it was still there. It wasn't in my head. It was real. And it was coming from the end of the street. With no other choice, I continued walking, driven by an unknown force, the voice pulling me forward. The street became narrower, more oppressive. The buildings leaned in, their walls cracked and decaying, their windows dark and empty, watching me. And then, I saw it. At the end of the street, hidden beneath a veil of falling snow, there was a figure. A shadow, tall and slender, standing perfectly still. The voice came from it, echoing in the silence. Mark. I couldn't move. The figure seemed to be beckoning me, drawing me in. I didn't want to approach, but I couldn't stop myself. The voice had a strange power over me, a magnetic pull that I couldn't resist. I took a step closer, my boots crunching in the snow, and as I did, the figure slowly turned, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was too tall, its limbs stretching out of proportion, its body twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. Its face was hidden beneath the hood of a long, dark coat, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching me. And as I took another step forward, I heard the voice again, this time clearer, more insistent. Come closer. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet refused to obey. I was frozen, trapped in this strange, unending street, drawn toward the figure like a moth to a flame. I couldn't remember how long I had been walking, how long I had been trapped in this cursed place. Time had no meaning here. The snow kept falling, and the silence kept pressing in. The figure was closer now, its form impossibly tall, its body swaying as if caught in the wind. And then, just as I was about to reach it, the world around me cracked. The street, the buildings, the snow, all of it shattered like glass, breaking apart into pieces, and I was falling into darkness. The last thing I heard was the voice, whispering my name one final time. Mark. And then, nothing. When I opened my eyes again, the snow was gone. The street was gone. I was back in the city, standing in the same spot where I had started my walk. But everything felt wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. The buildings around me seemed too tall, too silent. The world felt distorted, as though it had been reshaped while I wasn't looking. I took a step forward, but the ground felt different underfoot. The streets were no longer familiar. They were strange. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still walking down that endless street in the snow, trapped in a world that wasn't mine. And as I turned to leave, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. No matter how far I walked, I would never find my way back. The air felt different now, heavy with a strange sense of displacement, as though the world had tilted ever so slightly, and I was no longer quite where I was supposed to be. My feet moved, but they felt disconnected, as if they weren't mine. I could hear the soft crunch of snow beneath me, but the sound felt hollow, like it was coming from a distance. I tried to shake off the growing unease, but it clung to me like a shadow. Every time I glanced around, the city looked a little more foreign. The buildings were too tall, too close, their outlines too sharp, as if the whole place had been rearranged while I wasn't paying attention. The streets were quieter than usual, and the snow felt colder, somehow sharper against my skin. I told myself it was just a trick of the mind, the lingering effect of the strange encounter I had just experienced. Maybe it was just the snow, the way it warped everything around it. But deep down, I knew that something had changed. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what it was. The voice was still there, echoing in the back of my mind. It wasn't just the memory of it anymore. It was something more, something persistent, pulling at me from within, coaxing me towards something I couldn't yet see. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the familiar sounds of the city, but it was impossible. The voice was everywhere, slipping into every quiet moment. Mark. It was soft, almost gentle, but there was a coldness to it now, a distance that hadn't been there before. The voice was still calling my name, as though it was far away, but somehow closer at the same time. I paused on the corner of a street, trying to gather my thoughts. The city around me felt like a maze, its streets twisting in ways I didn't recognize. No matter how far I walked, nothing looked familiar. Every street I turned down felt like it led to another unfamiliar corner of the city. I decided to head back, retracing my steps, hoping to find something that would ground me. But the more I walked, the further I seemed to get from where I had started. The buildings loomed over me, their sharp, angular forms bending unnaturally toward me, their windows dark and empty, as though they were watching me. A gust of wind cut through the air, carrying with it the faintest whisper, almost drowned out by the howl of the wind. It was my name again. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me, pressing on all sides. Mark. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and for the first time, I realized that I wasn't alone. The city felt alive, but not in the way it should. It wasn't the warmth of a bustling place filled with life. It was something else, something old, something cold. The buildings felt like they were breathing, shifting around me, their shadows stretching and warping in the dimming light. I quickened my pace, desperate to find something familiar. But the harder I tried, the more lost I became. Every corner I turned, every alley I entered, only seemed to lead to more streets I didn't recognize. And then, when I stopped to take a breath, I realized that I had no idea where I was anymore. The streets were empty. Not a single person in sight. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world eerily still. But the silence was deafening, oppressive. It pressed against my ears, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. And then I heard it. A sound, soft at first, like the faintest scraping. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, heart racing, expecting to see someone who could explain what was happening, someone who could help. But there was nothing. Only the snow, falling gently around me, and the stillness that surrounded me like a thick blanket. I took a step forward, my breath visible in the cold air, and the scraping sound followed me. It was faint, like the dragging of something heavy across the ground. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. It was closer now, just behind me, almost as though it was breathing down my neck. Without thinking, I started walking again, faster this time, my heart pounding in my chest. The scraping grew louder, and then it stopped, only to be replaced by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. I spun around again, my pulse racing, but once again, there was nothing, except for the unmistakable sense of being watched. The streets felt narrower now, closing in around me, the buildings bending toward me like they were trying to trap me, to pin me in place. I kept walking, each step heavier than the last. The city seemed to be swallowing me whole, its streets twisting, the air growing colder, thicker. And then, just as I was about to break into a run, I saw something. At the end of the street, just past the shadow of a building, I saw a figure. A man, or at least, I thought it was a man. It was hard to make out through the thickening fog, but there was something about the way he stood, something that made my stomach tighten with fear. He was tall, unnaturally tall, his silhouette barely visible against the falling snow. His face was obscured by the dark shadows of his hood, but I could feel his eyes on me, piercing through the darkness, staring directly at me. And then he moved. I froze, watching as he slowly took a step toward me, his movements jerky, as though he was unsure of his own body, his limbs stretching and shifting unnaturally. He didn't walk like a person, he moved like something else, something not quite human. "Mark," the voice whispered again, soft and distant, but so close at the same time. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, even as every part of me screamed that I should turn and flee. The figure took another step toward me, and I realized, too late, that it was no longer the city I knew. It was something else entirely. I felt the cold seeping deeper into my bones as the figure drew closer. My legs were frozen, locked in place, even though every instinct was telling me to run. I wanted to scream, but the sound died in my throat, as if the very air had swallowed it whole. The snow around me seemed to thicken, swirling in unnatural patterns, as though the world itself was bending, folding in on itself. The figure, now unmistakably looming before me, took another slow, deliberate step. His movements were jerky, disjointed, like a marionette controlled by unseen hands. With each step, my heart pounded harder in my chest, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from him. "Mark." The voice whispered again, but this time it was unmistakably closer, right behind me. I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, something that was inside my head, pressing against my thoughts. I blinked, and for a moment, everything blurred together, the figure, the snow, the street. It was like I was seeing everything through a fog, struggling to keep my focus, but the more I tried, the more the world seemed to warp. The figure was growing, stretching, his outline becoming less human, less real. His form began to shimmer like smoke, slowly becoming something not of this world. I forced myself to take a step back, but it felt as though I was walking in place. I was no longer sure if the ground beneath me was solid, if the snow surrounding me was even real. The city felt wrong. It was as if it had become a vast, empty stage, and I was the only one trapped in this nightmarish play. The figure raised a hand, slowly reaching out toward me. Its fingers were long, impossibly so, and they seemed to stretch toward me with a horrible deliberateness. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My chest tightened, as if the air had turned to stone, making it harder and harder to breathe. "Mark, you shouldn't have come here," the voice said, and this time it wasn't just whispering. It was everywhere, surrounding me, echoing through the very air, through my thoughts, my body. And then the figure's hand brushed my shoulder. I flinched, as though the touch had burned me, and in that moment, everything changed. The cold intensified, the world around me collapsing into shadows and blurs. The city seemed to stretch and twist in impossible ways, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The streets, the buildings, the snow, all of it was folding inward, closing around me like an endless maze, trapping me in this place. I finally managed to tear my gaze from the figure. My heart raced, my breath shallow, as I turned to run anywhere away from that thing, away from the feeling that I was no longer in control of my own body. But as I looked down the street, I saw nothing but more of the same empty streets, twisted buildings, and snow that stretched forever in every direction. The snow had stopped falling, but the silence was deafening. It was as if the world had muted itself, leaving me alone in a frozen, desolate place. My legs finally responded, and I sprinted blindly down the street, hoping to find some exit, some sign of the world I knew. But the faster I ran, the farther the city seemed to stretch. The streets that had been there moments ago were gone, replaced by endless white, by a darkening fog that crept along the edges of my vision. I didn't dare look behind me, but I could feel it, its presence, growing closer. The air felt heavier, suffocating, like I was running through thick mud, every step feeling like it might be my last. I glanced over my shoulder once, and in the brief instant I allowed myself to look, I saw the figure again, closer, his movements more fluid now, more human. But there was something wrong about him, something wrong about everything. He was smiling. It wasn't a smile, really, it was a grin, wide and unnaturally stretched, his face twisting into something grotesque. His eyes, hollow and dark, seemed to flicker like flames, the light from them pulling at me, drawing me in like a moth to a fire. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't form, and the sound of my own breath, ragged and panicked, seemed to drown everything else out. I ran harder, not knowing where I was going, not knowing if there was even a way out. I was lost. Completely, utterly lost. And then, just as my legs began to feel like they might give way beneath me, I stumbled, falling forward into the snow. My hands hit the ground, and the cold seared through my skin, but I couldn't move, couldn't get up. I was frozen in place, as though the snow had wrapped itself around me, pinning me to the earth. And then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard a voice. "Mark, come back." The voice wasn't the same one as before. It was softer, almost tender now, like a call from home, from somewhere familiar, safe. My eyes burned with tears as I tried to lift myself up, but my body wouldn't cooperate. It felt as if something was holding me there, something invisible, something older than time itself. I turned my head, straining to see where the voice had come from, but all I could make out were the shadows of buildings stretching across the snow. The fog was thicker now, and the figure was nowhere to be seen. "Come back, Mark, it's not too late." The voice was closer now, a soft whisper in my ear. I gasped, turning sharply to find nothing. The world seemed to bend, to twist, as I fought to stay conscious, to stay grounded. The snow around me began to swirl again, faster now, the world spinning, but there was no escape. It was as if the city had become one big trap, and I was its prey, caught in a loop I couldn't escape. And then, just as I thought I might lose all sense of reality, I heard it again, the voice. Only this time, it wasn't coming from anywhere. It was inside my mind. "You're already lost." The words reverberated through my skull, as though they weren't just spoken but drilled into my consciousness. "You're already lost." It wasn't a warning. It wasn't even a statement. It felt like a conclusion, a final truth that had already been decided for me. The world around me seemed to warp with the force of it, the snow, the city, the air itself, all folding inwards like a twisted puzzle I could never hope to solve. I wanted to scream, to deny it, but my throat felt tight, constricted by the very air that surrounded me. I was lost, and I knew it now, with a cold certainty gnawing at the edges of my mind. The path I had walked, the street I had taken, it had all been an illusion. A trick. This city was not the one I knew. The familiar landmarks had vanished, replaced by endless streets that looped into themselves, walls that towered impossibly high, and a sky that seemed to fall lower, pressing down on me like the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs shaky beneath me, as though the very act of standing was a betrayal of my senses. Every step I took felt wrong, like I was walking on an unfamiliar surface, unsure whether the ground beneath me was real. The snow crunched beneath my boots, but even that sound felt off, as if it was echoing back at me from some hidden place in the distance. I glanced around, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement, shadows flickering in the corners of my vision, figures that were too quick to catch. But when I turned to face them, there was nothing. Only the endless stretch of streets, blanketed in white, and the oppressive silence that seemed to cling to everything. Then I heard the faintest sound. A rustle, far off, followed by the soft, rhythmic thump of footsteps. The figure. It was back. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. My eyes scanned the empty streets, the corners where the shadows seemed to twist and bend unnaturally. I couldn't see him, but I felt him, closer now, like a presence that was just beyond the edge of my awareness, a threat that was both invisible and inescapable. The footsteps grew louder, the sound of them echoing in the stillness. And then, through the dense fog that had settled over the city, I saw something. A shape. A silhouette, moving slowly but steadily toward me. Tall, imposing. I couldn't see its face, not clearly, but I could feel its eyes on me. The darkness of the figure seemed to bleed into the fog, merging with the shadows around it. He's coming, I thought, panic flooding my chest. I took a step back, then another, but the figure didn't stop. It just kept coming, its steps deliberate, calculated, as if it knew I wouldn't escape. I turned and ran. This time, there was no hesitation, no questioning whether it was real or not. The figure was real, the danger was real. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I pushed my legs to move faster, but the snow was thick, clinging to my boots, dragging at my every step. Behind me, the footsteps grew louder, closer, the sound of them unmistakable now, growing ever nearer with each passing second. I risked a glance over my shoulder, just a fleeting glance, and saw the figure, now only a few yards away. He was no longer moving slowly, he was sprinting toward me, his long limbs stretching with unnatural speed, his silhouette blurring, like something both human and not. No. No, no, no. I turned again, my breath coming in desperate gasps, and I pushed myself harder, faster, desperate to outrun the terror that chased me. But it was impossible. The city seemed to shift with every step I took, the street twisting on itself, the buildings leaning closer, as if they were part of a labyrinth designed to keep me trapped. There was no escape. There never had been. And then, in the midst of the endless snow and the choking fog, I saw it. The alley. A narrow passage between two buildings, dark and inviting. Without thinking, I darted into it, hoping to find something, anything, that might offer me a way out. I didn't dare look back as I plunged into the alley, my breath ragged and sharp. The air was colder here, the walls closing in on me, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I had to find a way to hide, to lose myself in the maze of the city. But as I ran, I began to notice something. The alley wasn't like the others. The walls on either side were too high, too smooth, like they were made of something other than brick. And the ground beneath my feet, it didn't feel right. It was soft, almost spongy, like I was running on something that was both solid and liquid at once. I slowed, my panic momentarily replaced by confusion. The sound of my footsteps had stopped. No more crunching snow, no more echo of movement. It was as if I were walking on air, with no ground beneath me. I stopped completely, my breath catching in my throat as I looked around. The alley stretched endlessly in both directions, no end in sight. The walls were now darker, more foreboding, and the air felt thick with a presence that wasn't just in the fog. It was in the very space around me, pressing in, like it was closing in on me from all sides. And then, I heard it. A voice. Soft. Familiar. "Mark, you're still here." I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing but the fog, the snow, and the walls that seemed to grow taller, more suffocating with each passing moment. The voice wasn't real. It couldn't be. But as I stood there, paralyzed, something shifted in the shadows. Something I couldn't see, but could feel, creeping closer. And I realized, in that horrible moment, that the city wasn't just alive, it was watching me. And it wasn't going to let me leave. The fog thickened around me, a suffocating blanket that seemed to pull the very air from my lungs. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, but it wasn't the chill of winter, it was something else. Something far darker. It was as if the city itself had become a living thing, wrapping me in its icy grip, drawing me deeper into its heart where escape was no longer a possibility. I stood frozen, my breath visible in the freezing air, but even that felt wrong. It lingered too long, like it didn't belong to me, like it was being pulled away from my body. I staggered backward, my eyes darting around, looking for some way out of this nightmare. The alley had no exit. The walls closed in with every step I took, the end nowhere to be seen, just endless snow and shadows stretching further into the abyss. "Mark, you're still here," the voice whispered again, softer this time, but with a subtle sense of satisfaction, as though it knew something I didn't. My name echoed in my ears, and with it came the undeniable sensation that someone, was right behind me. I spun, panic flooding me, but the alley was empty. It was always empty. My footsteps were muffled, my movements silent, as if I had become part of the city itself, lost to time, to space. The snow crunched beneath my boots, but there was no longer any sense of direction, no sense of up or down, only a suffocating, oppressive weight bearing down on me. I felt it before I saw it, the figure. That dark shape, that twisted silhouette that had been following me. It was there, in the fog, but this time it wasn't moving. It was standing still, as if waiting for me to approach, to step closer to whatever dark fate lay ahead. The figure didn't speak, but its presence was louder than any voice could be. The air felt charged, thick with something ancient and malevolent. I couldn't breathe properly, couldn't think. My mind was clouded with the overwhelming sense that whatever had been waiting for me in this city was now here, close enough to touch, and that touching it would mean my undoing. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. There had to be a way out. There had to be something, some way to break free of the pull this city had on me. I tried to turn, to run, but my legs refused to move. It was as if the ground itself had taken hold of me, refusing to let me escape. "Mark," the voice whispered again, a chill running down my spine as the figure began to move. This time, it was not slow and deliberate like before. It was coming toward me with unnerving speed, its long limbs stretching out unnaturally. The darkness that clung to it seemed to swallow the light around it, growing, expanding, until it was no longer a shape, but an all-consuming presence. I gasped, a sound that didn't quite make it past my lips. There was nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. The walls of the alley were too high, too smooth to climb. The fog had become a living thing, swirling and thickening, blocking any chance of seeing where I was going. And then I realized it wasn't the alley that had changed. It was me. The city wasn't just shifting around me. I was the one who was changing, twisting, unraveling, pulled further into its depths with each passing moment. My mind screamed for me to fight, to run, but my body felt frozen, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The figure was almost upon me now. Its face, if it even had one, was a void, an empty space where eyes should be. There was no humanity in it, no hint of anything that might have once been alive. Just darkness. I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The figure's shadow stretched over me, enveloping me like a blanket of cold, and I could feel it, that thing, that presence, filling my mind, pulling at my thoughts, drowning out everything but its voice. "Welcome home," it said, the words crawling into my skull like ice, freezing every thought, every hope, every flicker of resistance. I tried to scream again, but this time I felt the sound tear from my chest, rip through my body as if it were something foreign, something that didn't belong. It was too late. The city had already claimed me, and there was no going back. And then, as the world dissolved into darkness, I understood. The city wasn't lost. I was. Have you ever been driving alone on a quiet road in the middle of the night and suddenly felt like you weren't truly alone? It's the kind of feeling that sticks with you, the kind that lingers in your mind and whispers that something isn't right, even when you can't quite put your finger on it. That's exactly how I felt when it happened to me. I had been driving for hours, just me, the road, and the occasional hum of my car's engine cutting through the stillness. The headlights illuminated the empty highway, and the dark fields on either side stretched endlessly into the night. It was late, and I had been on the road for far too long, trying to make it back home after a long business trip. The sort of trip that makes you feel both physically and mentally drained, like all you want is to get to your destination and forget about the world for a while. The cold air outside pressed against the windows, the winter wind swirling, making everything feel isolated. There was nothing for miles. Just the occasional flicker of a distant streetlight and the low sound of tires on the asphalt. But then, as I glanced into the rearview mirror, I saw something that froze my blood. At first, it was just a shift in the mirror, an odd movement that didn't make sense. I quickly glanced back, thinking maybe it was the shadows playing tricks on me, but nothing was there. The back seat was empty, just the dark upholstery staring back at me. I dismissed it quickly, trying to focus on the road ahead, but the feeling of unease didn't leave. Something wasn't right. A few moments passed, and I glanced into the rearview mirror again. This time, my heart skipped a beat. There, sitting perfectly still in the back seat, was a woman. Her figure was hazy, like she didn't quite belong, but I could make out her features well enough. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the kind that belonged to another time, a long, dark dress with lace at the cuffs, her hair pinned up neatly in a way that was almost too precise, too deliberate. She was staring straight ahead, her eyes locked on something I couldn't see, her posture rigid and unmoving. I slammed my foot down on the brake, heart racing. My mind screamed for me to look away, to turn around, but I couldn't move. I had no idea how she got there. I hadn't seen anyone when I had gotten into the car, and certainly no one had approached. The back seat was empty when I started driving. But there she was, as real as anything. I took a deep breath, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I glanced again, hoping I had imagined it. But she was still there. I could see her now more clearly, the faint light from the dashboard illuminating her pale face. Her eyes were wide, staring into the mirror with an intense, almost pleading expression. But she didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stared. I wanted to pull over, but my body wouldn't obey. My foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, urging the car to move faster, but my eyes were drawn back to the mirror. She was still there, the same as before, her eyes fixed on mine as if she were waiting for something. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she moved. But not in the way a person would move. She simply shifted, like she was being drawn closer to me by an invisible force. Her head tilted ever so slightly to the side, and her gaze became more intense. It was as if she was trying to tell me something, but the message wasn't one I wanted to hear. I could feel the sweat beginning to bead on my forehead, my pulse racing. My mind screamed at me to pull over, to stop the car and get out, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. I knew I should, but something held me there, paralyzed in that moment. The woman in the back seat slowly opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I could see her lips moving, forming words, but they didn't reach me. It was as if she was trying to speak across some vast distance, some invisible barrier between us that I couldn't cross. I wanted to scream, to demand she stop, to tell her to leave me alone, but the fear in my chest was too much. I was frozen, watching her move ever closer, her face inching toward the rearview mirror, her eyes growing darker with each passing second. The only sound now was the rhythmic hum of the engine and the blood pounding in my ears. And then, as I glanced into the mirror once more, her face was right there, just inches from mine. Her lips parted, and I heard her whisper, "You're not alone." The words sent a chill down my spine. It felt as though they had been spoken directly into my soul. But the scariest part? She wasn't smiling. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking, but somehow I managed to grip the steering wheel even tighter. The car seemed to lurch forward, the tires screeching against the cold road. But all I could focus on was the woman in the back seat, her cold, unblinking eyes and the whisper that still echoed in my mind. "You're not alone." The words were like a weight pressing against my chest. It wasn't just the fear of her presence that chilled me, it was the way she spoke, like she knew something I didn't. Like she was inviting me into something I wasn't ready to understand. I stole another glance at the rearview mirror. The woman's face was still close, too close. Her lips were drawn into a faint, unsettling frown, and the eyes that had once appeared emotionless now seemed almost hungry, as if she were waiting for something, waiting for me to make the next move. But what could I do? I was trapped. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of me, but I couldn't bring myself to focus on anything other than her. The darkened road felt suffocating, the world around me narrowing until it was just me, her, and the weight of her gaze. A cold draft swept through the car, chilling me to the bone. I quickly reached for the window button, desperate to clear the air, to create some space between us. The window made a grinding sound as it slowly descended, but as soon as the cold night air hit my face, the woman's eyes locked onto mine once more. I swerved, startled by the intensity of her stare. The car's tires screamed in protest, but I quickly corrected myself, trying to focus on the road. I needed to get away from her, whatever she was, but the more I tried to ignore her, the more I realized that something was terribly wrong. The woman's presence was like a magnetic force, pulling me in even when I fought against it. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, but this time she was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief, my pulse still racing. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe the exhaustion, the isolation, the endless hours on the road had played tricks on my mind. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, telling myself to calm down. It was just a figment of my imagination. That's all. But then I heard it. A soft sound, a whisper, coming from the back seat. I could feel my heart drop to my stomach as I slowly turned my head to look over my shoulder. The woman was back, sitting perfectly still, but this time, her face was no longer expressionless. She was smiling, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was wide, stretching unnaturally across her face, her eyes gleaming with something dark and unsettling. She didn't speak this time. Instead, her fingers twitched slightly, like she was about to move. And I knew, deep down, that something was about to happen. I didn't know what, but I could feel it. It was in the air, in the silence that had settled around us. The road ahead grew darker. The streetlights blurred into nothingness, leaving the world outside the car completely black, as though the car was floating through an endless void. I tried to speed up, but the car seemed to be moving slower with each passing second, as though the road itself was stretching, refusing to let me go. The tires hummed, but the sound felt distant, muffled, as if the world around me was fading. Suddenly, the woman's voice broke through the silence. "Turn around." Her voice was soft, yet carried a force that made every hair on my body stand up. It was not just a request, it was an order. I froze. My hands tightened on the wheel, but my body wouldn't obey. I wanted to keep driving, to get away from her, but something about the command made it impossible to move. "Turn around," she repeated, her voice growing clearer, more insistent. I couldn't resist anymore. Without thinking, my hand slowly turned the wheel to the right. The car veered off the road, tires crunching on the gravel as I drove into the darkness of a narrow, winding path I had never seen before. My heart pounded against my ribcage, but I couldn't stop myself. The woman's presence had consumed everything, my thoughts, my will, my very movements. The road twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, like I was driving through a maze that I couldn't escape. The car's headlights illuminated nothing but empty trees and shadows that seemed to stretch and grow with every turn. The cold air inside the car grew thick, suffocating, as though the temperature was dropping by the second. I tried to scream, to yell out, to snap myself out of this trance, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. All that filled the space was her breathing, steady and calm, just behind me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed on the brakes, jerking the car to a halt. The engine sputtered, and the world outside went completely still. No wind. No sound. Just darkness pressing in from all sides. I didn't dare look back. But I could feel her. I could feel her eyes on me, even without looking into the mirror. And then, through this suffocating silence, I heard it. A soft laugh. A laugh that made my skin crawl, because it wasn't just a woman's laugh, it was something else. Something older. Something that didn't belong. It was then that I realized I wasn't just alone with her. I was trapped in whatever world she had brought me to, and I didn't know how to escape. The laugh echoed in my ears, louder now, bouncing off the walls of the car as if the very vehicle itself was alive. I could feel it pressing in on me, suffocating me, like a force that wanted to crush me from all sides. But it wasn't just the laugh, it was the weight of her presence, the knowledge that I was no longer in control of anything. I wanted to move, to get out of the car, but my body wouldn't listen. My mind screamed at me to drive, to flee, but I sat frozen, the steering wheel now slick with sweat from my trembling hands. My breathing came in shallow gasps, my heart hammering against my chest as if it were trying to escape. I had no idea where I was anymore. The road was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling. It was as if the landscape around me had shifted, transformed into a place that defied all logic. There were no landmarks, no signs, no way of telling which direction I was headed in. The trees outside had become twisted, gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands reaching down to grab me. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, broken only by the occasional whisper of the woman behind me. I dared not turn around. Not yet. I couldn't risk it. Her voice, soft and cold, slid through the silence like a blade. "Why are you running, dear?" It was the first time she had spoken directly to me, and it sent a chill so deep into my bones that I thought I might freeze right then and there. I swallowed hard, trying to force words from my throat, but nothing came out. I could feel her eyes on me, even though I refused to look. "You're not going to escape," she whispered, her voice like a lullaby, calm, soothing, yet utterly terrifying. "This place isn't like the world you came from. It doesn't let you leave once you've entered." I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but something inside me told me that doing so would only make things worse. That it might trigger something darker, more dangerous. So, I sat there, silently praying that the woman would disappear, that the nightmare would end. But it didn't. Instead, the air grew colder still, and the silence grew heavier until every breath I took felt like I was breathing underwater. The windows fogged up, obscuring my view of the twisted trees, leaving only my reflection, distorted and blurred in the glass. The woman was still behind me. I could feel her watching, waiting, like a predator just behind my shoulder. And then I felt it. A pressure in the air. A shift, as though something was moving in the darkness around me. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise, and my entire body stiffened. Something was out there. The woman's voice broke through my growing panic. "Look," she said, her tone suddenly urgent. "Look at what you've done." I didn't understand. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of her words, trying to piece together what was happening. I was so disoriented that I didn't even realize I had already turned the key in the ignition, starting the car again. The engine rumbled to life, but it felt wrong, as though the car itself was no longer a part of the world I knew. I slowly reached for the rearview mirror, afraid of what I might see but unable to resist. What I saw made my blood run cold. The reflection wasn't just of me sitting in the driver's seat. No, the rearview mirror now showed a road, one I hadn't seen before. A road that stretched endlessly into the distance, but not like the ones I had driven on before. This road was dark, cracked, and appeared to lead nowhere. It twisted and wound in impossible ways, as if it were trying to confuse me, to lead me deeper into whatever dark place this was. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what stood at the end of the road. A figure. It was barely visible, a shadow standing motionless in the distance, but I could see it, hear it, even though the car was completely silent. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs stretched out in a grotesque manner. Its face was hidden in darkness, but I knew, deep down, that it was watching me. "Do you see it?" The woman's voice was soft again, almost too soft. "He's waiting for you." The words sent a wave of pure terror through me, and for a brief moment, I considered driving away. But I couldn't. The road, This road wouldn't let me leave. It was like a trap, a maze with no exit, and the more I resisted, the more I realized I was only drawing closer to the figure. I could feel the car lurch forward as if some invisible force was pulling me in. The steering wheel felt heavier, the gas pedal stuck beneath my foot. I couldn't stop myself from moving toward that shadow, that dark figure. The woman was still there, but she was silent now. She no longer spoke, and I could feel her presence growing more distant as the figure in the mirror drew closer. I tried to turn the wheel again, but it was useless. The car was no longer mine to control. It had become part of the road, part of the world that the woman had brought me into. And then I heard it. A low, guttural laugh. But this one wasn't hers. It came from the figure that was now impossibly close. The car jerked violently, and I screamed. The figure was standing directly in front of the car now, blocking the road. Its face was still hidden, but the air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. The woman's voice returned, but this time it wasn't soft. It was sharp, commanding. Now, you're truly mine. My heart pounded violently against my chest as the car continued to lurch forward, as though some unseen force had taken control. My hands gripped the steering wheel, but they felt detached, as if my own body had lost its connection to me. I could see the figure now, standing only a few feet from the front of the car, and I knew that if I didn't stop, I would hit it. But I couldn't stop. The woman's voice came again, but this time there was an unmistakable malice to it. Do you think you can escape now? You're in my world now, and there's no way out. I screamed and slammed on the brakes, but the car didn't respond. The figure in the mirror wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had form, it had shape. It was tall and monstrous, with long, spindly limbs that stretched unnaturally long, its face a void of nothingness, but its eyes glowed. They glowed bright red, like two burning embers, and they locked onto mine as if they could see into the deepest corners of my soul. I couldn't look away. No matter how hard I tried, my eyes were drawn to the reflection, to the figure's eyes, those red eyes that filled my vision and made everything else fade away. My breath was ragged, my chest tight with panic, and I realized I had to escape. But how? How could I escape when I wasn't even sure if I was still on the road? I turned the wheel sharply, but it wasn't like turning the wheel of a car. It felt more like trying to move through thick mud, my body straining, my muscles fighting against a force that was stronger than me. The figure in the mirror did not move. It stayed there, watching, waiting. Its eyes never left mine, and I could feel its gaze creeping down my spine, crawling over my skin. My palms were slick with sweat, and my whole body was trembling, but it wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something more primal. I felt like I was being pulled in. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. The shadowy figure was still there, but now it was moving, slowly, deliberately, as though it was savoring the moment. Each step it took was deliberate, each movement of its limbs unnatural. I could hear the soft crunch of snow beneath its feet, even though the car was still in motion, and yet the world outside seemed frozen, stuck in time. I pressed the gas pedal harder, hoping that by some miracle I could break free. The tires screeched in protest, and the engine roared, but the figure stayed close, almost as if it was drawing closer with every attempt to escape. And then it happened. The rearview mirror cracked. A sharp, jagged line appeared in the glass, spreading from one side to the other. For a moment, everything was still, and I thought I had imagined it, but then the glass splintered completely, sending shards scattering across the car's interior. I could hear the soft tinkling of the broken pieces as they hit the floor, and my breath hitched. In the reflection of the shattered mirror, I saw it. The figure was now standing inside the car. It was no longer just a shadow. It was real, solid, towering over me, its long, bony fingers pressing against the back of the front seat. Its eyes, those cursed eyes, glowed even brighter, and it leaned down close to my ear. The stench of decay, of rot, filled the air, and I gagged, but I couldn't pull away. It was like I was frozen in place, unable to move or scream. "Now, we're truly together," the figure whispered, its voice low and guttural, like a hiss from the deepest depths of hell. "You cannot leave. You belong to me now." I could feel its cold breath on the back of my neck, its presence suffocating. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body betrayed me. I couldn't make a sound, couldn't move. I was trapped, held in place by a force I could not understand. The woman's voice came again, a soft chuckle in the distance, as if she were enjoying my torment. "Do you feel it now?" she asked, her voice mocking. "The bond? The tether that binds you to this place? You cannot escape it. No one ever does." My thoughts were a jumbled mess of panic and confusion. I couldn't make sense of anything anymore. The world around me was falling apart, and I was no longer sure if the road, the car, or even the air was real. It all felt like a dream, or worse, like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The car jolted, and I was thrown forward against the seatbelt. My heart was racing in my chest, and I gasped for air, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I looked around, but the road was still the same, dark, endless, and twisted. The trees outside seemed to bend and stretch in unnatural ways, as though the world was warping, reshaping itself. But there was no sign of the figure anymore. The back seat was empty. I blinked rapidly, unsure if I had imagined it all, but the cold chill in the air, the lingering sense of dread, told me that it was far from over. I looked up at the rearview mirror again, and for a moment, I thought I saw her, the woman, standing behind me. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Only the road ahead. Dark. Endless. Empty. And I knew, deep down, that I wasn't going to make it out of this place. Not alive. Not ever. I slammed my foot on the brake, but the car didn't stop. It kept moving forward, deeper into the darkness, and I felt the air grow colder as the laughter, faint but unmistakable, returned. The woman was still with me. And this time, she wasn't alone. I was not driving. I was just along for the ride. I don't know how much time passed. Minutes? Hours? It felt as if I had been trapped in the same moment, the same endless road, for an eternity. The car moved on its own, as though it had become part of the twisted, shifting reality around me. My eyes burned from exhaustion, but I couldn't look away from the windshield. I couldn't look away from the endless darkness that stretched in front of me. The laughter came again, softer now, but unmistakable. It was the woman, and she was closer this time, the sound of her voice no longer distant but echoing directly behind me, in the car itself. "You're almost there," she whispered, her voice laced with something that sent a shiver crawling down my spine. "Almost home." I tried to speak, to ask her what she meant, but my voice caught in my throat. It felt like something was blocking me, suffocating me from the inside. The air had thickened, pressing down on my chest like a weight that I couldn't escape. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, and this time, her face filled the reflection, pale, gaunt, with hollow, black eyes that stared at me with an intensity one could feel in my bones. Her lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of comfort, it was a smile of cruelty. "You're mine now," she said softly. "You've always been mine." My heart pounded, and the panic surged again. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The car seemed to pick up speed, hurtling forward without my control, and the road had become a blur of white snow and blackness, stretching on forever, looping in a never-ending cycle. Suddenly, the car jerked violently to one side. The tires screeched against the icy road, and I felt the vehicle lurch, as though it were fighting me, resisting my attempts to steer it back. I slammed my hands against the wheel, desperate to regain control, but it was useless. The car was no longer responding to my actions. The woman's face appeared again, this time right beside me, her cold breath brushing against my skin. She leaned in closer, her face inches from mine. I could feel her icy fingers grazing my arm, but when I looked down, there was nothing there. "You don't get it, do you?" she whispered, her voice calm but tinged with something dark and insidious. "You can't leave this place. You never will." I wanted to scream, to fight back, but it was as if the words had been stolen from my mouth. I was paralyzed, trapped in this nightmare, unable to break free. My mind raced with fear, but no matter how hard I tried to think clearly, my thoughts kept spiraling into chaos. And then, just as I was about to lose all hope, the car stopped. Silence. For a moment, I thought I was free. I dared to believe that the nightmare had ended, that I was no longer bound to the endless road. But then I looked around. I wasn't in the same place anymore. The world had changed. The snowy landscape was gone, replaced by a vast, desolate wasteland of dark, cracked earth. The sky above me was an unnatural shade of deep red, swirling with storm clouds that seemed to pulse with energy. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the wind carried with it a distant, mournful wail that sent chills down my spine. I looked at the rearview mirror one last time. And there she was, standing outside the car, her figure tall and imposing, the same empty black eyes staring back at me. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, countless others stood, figures, pale and indistinct, shadows that stretched and writhed like smoke. They were waiting, watching. And then, I heard her voice again, clear and final. "You're not going anywhere." The car doors slammed shut on their own, locking me in. I felt the overwhelming presence of the figures outside, their gazes fixed on me, suffocating me from all sides. The wind howled louder, drowning out everything else. I pounded against the windows, but no sound came from my mouth. I was trapped. I was stuck in this place with them forever. And as the shadows closed in, I realized with horrifying clarity I had never been on the road at all. The road was inside me. There was no escape. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.